The first thing he lost was the sound of his name. It went out of him in the first thunder of crossbows, as if the air itself forgot the word it had carried for near to 2 decades. Wine flashed in the candlelight like garnet, like blood in a cup, and men stood from their trestles with the unsteady instinct of wolves who hear their own dead approach. He had time to think of his mother's hands on his face that morning, the coolness of her fingers, the dry kiss she pressed to his brow to hide the tremor in her mouth. Then he saw the glimmer across a man's sleeve, a tilt of iron, and the hall erupted into a storm of bolts and steel and screaming. He was not quick enough to draw steel. His first act of survival was not a sword stroke but a fall. The bench went backward with him, and a bolt meant for his eye skated off the edge of the overturned board and struck his shoulder at an angle that spared the artery but bit to the bone. The pain was so clean it seemed to make a shape in the air. He tried to breathe through it and breathed smoke, grease, and the sharpened sour of fear that lives in men like a second soul. The music had changed. The players, thin men with clever hands, went on with their tune because that was what they had come to do, and because the first lesson in such halls is that you are paid to ignore what you are paid to cause. A drum beat like a heart and then like a fist, and the fiddle rose sharp and bright over the noise of ruin. Robb took it in with the clarity that comes when a blow clears away all but one truth. He could not die here, under their roof, at their table, where his father's ghost would be forced to listen to the laughter that would follow. The world separated into the smooth rush of the bolt in his shoulder, the clatter of the fallen bench, the struggling tangle of his legs in the tablecloth, and a narrow path beneath another table where grease dripped from platters and feet stamped in sudden panic. He slid like a fox under a fence. Someone tripped and came down hard beside him, and a tankard rolled, and one of the players' bows snapped with a sound like a twig breaking in winter hands. He felt the floors grain through his palm. The boards were warm with spilled stew. Around the high tables, men were dying in their silver song of mail. He tasted iron. Footfalls stamped and slipped, and under another board he saw the trembling feet of a woman in slippers damp from the rushes. There was a teeth-bared grin of a familiar face turned new in hatred, and then that face vanished again in a tide of bodies. He thought not clearly, not yet. A girl's hand snatched his sleeve. It was small, cold, sticky with wine. She stooped into the shadow where he lay and hissed, "Your Grace," with an urgency that did not fit the room. When he opened his mouth to argue the truth of any title belonging to him in that moment, her fingers pressed the back of his hand with surprising force. "Not here," she said. "Not here." He saw a freckled face, eyes like river water, a cap of hair like burnt straw. She wore the apron of a scullion gone older than her years but not long at it, the ties cut too short and knotted in a hurry. Another bolt struck the plank near his temple and buried there like a needle. The girl flinched and swore in the small, honest way of those whose curses still belong to their own mouths and not to their lords. "On your knees," she said. "They'll not look under where they're standing on." He thought of his mother again, of the soft way she would twist her mouth at loudness and bad language, and he crawled. Her arm was thin as a willow rod, but she bore his weight with a strength that lived in bone, not muscle. Twice they had to stop to let a patter of feet pass, and once he lay with his cheek pressed to the floor while men struggled and fell, and he had to swallow down the impulse to bite through the wood to keep himself from crying out when someone knocked his shoulder. The girl led him to the side door by a way he would never have known. A gap in boards, dark, low, rank with the breath of the river. She kicked aside a chain that had been coiled loose on purpose and pulled at something that had been greased to slide. Then they were in a narrow chase between walls where the air smelled less of meat and more of damp clay, and he could see a faint lighter darkness ahead where water shivered. They crouched at the opening, listening. The hall roared like a sea, with a high sound threaded through it that he knew meant a woman was standing and giving something of her heart away with every word. His mother's voice. He did not know whether he heard it or the memory of it. He did not know whether memory was not itself sometimes a road for ghosts to take. The girl's hand left his sleeve. "No sound," she mouthed. He nodded, though he wanted to tell her that he had already made every noise he would ever make for the rest of his life in those first few seconds, that he had spent his voice on a surprise he should have seen coming, and that now his silence would be as absolute as the silence of the dead. He put his good hand to the rim of the opening and felt, to his near hysterical relief, the coarse freedom of rope. They had tied a rope there for someone. For him or for another, he would never know. They slid down into water, a quick, cold embrace that took his breath and then gave it back sharper. The girl went first and turned to steady him. And for a moment he hated her for how small she was and how much he depended on her and how her hair clung in ropes to her cheeks like river weed. Then he put his body where hate could not live, one hand to the rope. His teeth clenched on the inside of his cheek, and he let himself drop. The water took him to the chest, to the neck, to the mouth. The pain in his shoulder found a new language as the river closed. "Keep to the posts," the girl whispered. "Feel them. 3 down, breath, then pull left. The eddy will hold you." He could not ask how she knew this, whether she had mapped the currents as a child, whether she had been told by a man on a night when words are cheaper than bread. He nodded again, and they moved like frogs along the palings in the black. Above, noise, laughter hard and pale, a shout that asked for someone's head, the snap of a bowstring, the wet slap after. He wanted to look back into the place where his mother's voice had gone, to make the past give him a different present, as if he could gather her words into his hands and knit them into armor, into time. The river nudged his ribs. The girl's grip on his sleeve was steadier than anything he had felt since the first bolt sang. They were at the 3rd post. He filled his chest as if he could borrow a cold from the water. He let go of the posts and kicked out to the left. The river spoke a softer tongue there, a swirl that folded him and kept him low under a lip of stone. He pressed his face to that stone. He tasted moss and the bitterness of old iron. A hand he could not see pushed the back of his head gently down, hers. He gave himself to that pressure. He had been a king. It was easier than he would have guessed to learn the small obedience that life sometimes demanded. The river ran their bodies along the stone and then released them into a darkness where the light of torches above could not reach. The girl's breath struck him in small, fast bursts. He worked his legs as best he could. His shoulder burned and his fingers felt like sticks someone else had pushed into his hands. They passed a place where someone had dumped old rushes, and the wet straw brushed his face with a whisper that sounded like his name trying to remember itself. When they at last dragged up in mud under a quay lip where boats once had tied and did not now, he lay with his cheek to the stone and drank in the smell of moss, fish, brown water, and the faint stale scent of barley that might have been trapped in the stones from years of spilled sacks. He thought he could sleep there until snow took him, if only it would be allowed. The girl was looking back the way they had come. Her teeth flashed in the dark. "They're not coming this way," she said, and if she lied, she was good at it. He had to ask, "Your name?" She looked surprised, as if he had asked the river's name or the shape of the wind. "Nella," she said after a second, and his mind supplied Nella of the bins or Nella Fry or Nella who knew, and none of them felt true. "You'll stay quiet. A boat down past the bend. If we take the light, they'll see the drag." He nodded. His body had begun to realize how cold it was, and he could feel the waves of it come in like the slow wash after a boat's passage. Nella came close and eased his arm over her shoulders. The touch made him want to weep in a way that would have humiliated him yesterday and did not touch him now. He had no hands left for pride. The two of them were born as one awkward creature from the mud and edged down the river's underlip. If he had fallen alone, he would not have risen. Nella kept him standing, and he gave her everything he had that was not blood. Twice they crouched as a torch passed above. Once, a bottle broke and a rain of glass rang on the stones like a hailstorm in summer and cut the boy of him to ribbons again. He caught himself on the 4th post they found and made his way around it, and by then the barns were a smell in the distance, and the hall was a bell that had rung and been stilled. They found the boat where she said, a low shape like a leaf that had remembered how to float. It was scummed at the waterline and smelled of fish skins, dead oysters, and the old sun. The oars were short, thick, cut in haste or long use. She got in first and made it steady with 2 fingertips and a prayer that did not address any god he had learned. He slid in and groaned without grace when the boat rocked. She pushed off with her foot and took the oars. It was a miracle that the first pull did not pull him back into death. He lay in the belly of that boat like any broken soldier, with his good arm out to steady himself and his bad arm cradled in his lap like a child too angry to sleep. He listened to the oars. They made little sounds, high and private. The river made the opposite, deep and public. They set off down the hidden middle path between both. He watched the bank slide. Shadows poured off the pilings. On the far side, a dog raised its head and then put it down again, as if it had decided all men's business was a misunderstanding. He thought of Grey Wind then, and the thought was not a thought but the absence of a heartbeat, because for a moment he was entirely inside the body of something not present, the memory of speed and low brush and a scent opening like a secret door. Then it was gone, and the cold was very near to his bones, and he tucked nothing to his chest because he had nothing not already tucked. Nella took them where the river widened its voice and flattened its hands, where the weeds grew high and the frost that would come in the mornings of a later year would hold spider webs like crystal maps at dawn. She did not row as a woman taught by men rows. She rowed as someone who had taught herself and learned from the water. She gave nothing away to the light. She did not turn her head to look back. It would have been enough to make him love her in another season, and in this one it made him decide not to forget her if he lived. The first night swallowed them complete. The second night came at once because time in such cold jumps and doubles back. He passed in and out of himself. Once he woke to understand that Nella had wrapped her own apron around his shoulder and her cloak around his ribs, and she rode in her shift with her teeth locked and her jaw muscles working like someone sharpening a tool on a stone. He tried to speak and she shook her head fiercely without looking at him. When he slept again, he went int. Oh, a grove he knew and did not know. He stood under a tree that bled white sap into cold air. The eyes in its smooth, pale face were shut, and there were tears that were not tears drying in the seams. He laid his good hand flat on the bark. It was cool, and something in him that had been tight since he was a child loosened, as if it had been waiting for this precise degree of chill. In the way of dreams that are not mere dreams, he did not ask questions there. A wind came from nowhere and nosed his hair like a curious hound, and then brought another smell, one he had never known in waking. A metal sweetness, a fire salt flavor, the breath of a beast that had never lived in his father's stories. The tree's carved mouth did not move. The eyes opened. They were not eyes but the willingness of the world to look back at him. He woke weeping, and it was not from pain. When dawn came, it came gray and reluctant and took its time choosing things it would admit. The marsh was a mutter to left and right, reed and sedge and low willow, and the sky was not a sky but a lid. Nella had beached them in a fold of mud where the water went gentle, and there were prints of her feet and ankles in the damp silt, and prints of someone else whose heels never quite committed. Light shapes like a heron had stepped there in human form. He looked up and saw men like reeds and reeds, short, corded, built for water rather than stone, faces painted in a dull green that made them not there if you did not already know they were. One had a spear whose head was black glass and drank the thin light as if it were starving. "Bosun says you'll come if you're meant," the speaker said, and Robb did not know whether that meant him or the wind. "They called him Your Grace," Nella said. "In the hall. Once. I think more than once. Once is the number the South likes," the man said. "We know other counts." Robb pushed himself up on his elbow. The world tilted and tilted again and then stopped. He did not try to stand. "My name is..." He had to frame the fact in a way that would not betray him to anyone but himself. "Better to have a river name for now," the man said easily. "We have one kept behind a sapling for borrowers. Call yourself Reed's guest and be done with it." Nella made a small, startled laugh she stifled in her hand. More girl than she had been all night. "Reed's guest," she said. "See that? I took him then," she added, and her mouth hardened in a way that did not fit the girl's laugh at all. "I took him from them." "You did," the man agreed, sober as a priest. They did not embrace her. They did not touch her at all. They looked with respect and then looked away, the way men look at a tree that has stood through a storm. One of them held out a wisp of something that smoked. Nella took it and inhaled, coughing at the leaf smell and the pepper bite. Her eyes watered. The man who had offered it grinned like a jack and then schooled his face again. "You cannot be Reed and stay," the first man said to her. "You've moved the waters already." "I know the way back without Prince," she said. "You don't have to point." Robb tried to rise. She shook her head at once and put a hand on his shoulder to keep him down. He had no right to the hand and was grateful for it. "I'll be found if I don't move," she said softly. "I'm not supposed to be missing. They'll ask where I went. I'll say I saw him fall into the river and tried to catch a better view." "They'll kill you for that," Robb said through a throat that had forgotten how it was made. "They'll kill me for anything if it pleases them," she said. "Or not if it doesn't. That's not in my hands. This, though." She touched his cheek as if he were a younger brother she forgave for being stupid. "This I did on purpose," she said. "You owe me a song that doesn't make anyone bleed." He reached for her and did not reach her. The marsh men were already drawing his crude boat up into the reeds, where it would turn to mud in a season and feed the sedge it had once cut. Nella adjusted her cap with shaking fingers and rubbed mud into the hem of her skirt to make it look as if she had done something proper in the night. She looked at him once more, and he took that look into the well part of himself where he put the few quiet things he had been given. Then she was gone, up through the reeds with a little splash of water on her ankles. Robb lay back and let the marshmen take his weight. They were quieter than the river. They held him in a cloth stretcher of woven willow and nettle that did not creak. They moved over ground he could not name. They went where a footstep made no sign and where a mistake would sink you to the shoulder. They smelled of fish, smoke, and a wetness that was not simply water. They smelled like it was possible to live without walls. They brought him to a place that was not a castle and was all the more dangerous for not pretending to be. The reed halls sat low, rafted on buoyant timbers and bound with living vines that filled their own cracks. Their roofs were thatch shaped like sleeping animals. There was no gate. To enter, you had to know you were invited. For all that, it felt more defended than a keep with 3 draws and a portcullis. He understood what his father had meant about Moat Cailin, about the ways the North defends itself by sinking you into the earth until you have to learn the language to ask for help. A woman with hair braided in a rope that hung nearly to her ankles met them. Her face was ash-streaked. She had a small child perched on one hip as if balance itself were an heirloom. She looked at Robb a long time while the child traced her collarbone with a solemn finger. "What are you?" she asked him flat. "Cold," he said before he could think of a lie. "Sorry." She tilted her head, the ghost of a smile at one corner of her mouth. "Then you're human, if nothing else. Bring him," she said to the men, and they brought him where she indicated, to a chamber lifted slightly above the waterline, where the floor had the give of a good bough and the air smelled of mint, smoke, and a faint sweet that he later learned was the sap of a tree brought from a far shore. She and another woman put hands to his shoulder without fuss or heat. They looked with the interest of craftsmen at a tool that could be salvaged. They had a little knife of bone and a pot of something green and a jar of something black. When they cut the bolt out of him, he bit the strap they gave. He remembered his mother again, because every pain is a road to a mother if you let it be. He did not cry out aloud. The child who had been on the woman's hip watched from the door, serious as a judge, and chewed a strip of dried fish as if the act were the village's heartbeat. When it was over, he lay listening to rain slick the thatch above. It came and went like someone thinking steady for a while, then assuming another thought, then returning to the first. They bound his shoulder in layers. Something cool that made the deep muscle unclench a degree, something rough that would make new blood know its boundaries, and a band of leather pierced with cord that held the whole with a bowyer's knowledge of tension. After, the ash-streaked woman laid her palm on his brow and looked in his eyes. "You'll have dreams," she said. "They'll be more true than most. That is not a blessing unless you learn how to carry it." He would have asked what she meant, but a new tiredness took him. It was not the flailing exhaustion of the river. It was the deep pull of a bed that knew your shape. He folded into it like a trapped bird who has discovered the hand that holds it is not cruel, and he went down. He woke to a hand on his wrist and a voice that had a reed's calm. "Lord of the losing and the finding," the voice said mildly. "I would not say it to your face if you were standing and I were kneeling with my family bound beside me, but it is well done to have survived." Robb opened his eyes. A man stood at the edge of the mat. He was neither tall nor short, neither handsome nor ugly. He looked like what water looks like when it decides it will carry you and not drown you, a thing with its own rules that you cannot change by argument. His hair was stubbornly brown. There were lines at the corners of his mouth that you belonged to only from years of smiling and of not. His hands were the hands of someone who made and broke small things. "Reed," Robb said, and the name felt more true than any he had been addressed by in the last year. "Howland," the man corrected gently, "but we are not in the land of first names being the point. You are Reed's guest here. That is enough. We have seen your face in the ice for a year, and the knots know your weight now. If you like, I will call you boy. If you do not, I will call you friend. You will tell me what you can give if you wish me to give what I can." "Is my mother?" Robb asked, and his own voice stopped him. Howland Reed did not pretend to take the pain from words. He could have lied. The Marsh people had a talent for turning aside danger with a sentence. He did not. "She went where all mothers go when they choose their children first," he said. "She spent all her music and then had none left for herself. If you listen tonight with your lungs, you may catch the last bar in the fog. That is all I will tell you. The rest is yours." Robb closed his eyes. Inside them, a hall, firelight, a table, a woman's hair unpinned, the knuckles of a hand tight enough to leave the bones white. Outside them, rain. Between the two, the space where a man learns that he can sit up and not die. He sat up. "It was my fault," he said. "If I had—" "Fault?" Howland said, as if considering a small, troublesome fish. "I have seen it swimming in men since I was young. It likes to school. It has too many cousins. It gives no meat. It is not a good fish to eat. Will you keep it if you are starving?" "I made oaths," Robb said. He felt the old, resentful heat rise and let it rise. "I broke one and others broke theirs in answer. If I had not, if many things had not," Howland said dryly, "we could weave all winter. You are a boy they called a king and a man who lost his mother in a house where bread was served. Those are facts. What you carry them to is a choice. Men forget that. They think a fact has a leash." Robb looked down at his hands. The right one was nimble, his fingers still quick with the memory of reins and sword hilt and his father's knife when he had cut meat by campfires. The left lay quiet in its sling, harmless and fat as a butchered bird. He wanted to break a cup, but the Reed house had no cups made to break, and if it had, he would not have broken one. "How long?" he asked after a while. "Does a man here take to learn to move in this water and not sink?" "You sink first," Howland said. "Then you stop. If you are in a hurry, learn to be graceful. The marsh punishes speed. We have time here when we decide to. The South eats time. Sit with us as long as it takes to make a different kind of hunger." So he sat. It is strange the things a man who has worn a crown learns when he is given no chair. He learned how to step into a boat without waking it. He learned how to hold his breath in the long shallow of rushes and how to come up like a fish among fish, with bubbles in his hair that did not betray his breath to the air. He learned how to move through a day without reaching for a sword, how to carry a spear whose business was not only killing. Little children with faces still soft with milk taught him to ply a net with a twist of the wrist that made the mesh turn to water and the water turn to night. The old taught him how to listen to something that was not speech. He watched a woman pull a thorn from a boy's foot and call it by a name and blow on it, and the boy laughed and did not bleed much. He learned a word for the light that sits under fog L. I coin under linen and another for the taste of rain before it falls. His shoulder healed slowly and crookedly because that was the kind of healing that lasts. The flesh mended around a pain that would be a friend now. When he slept in the Reed house with its gentle tilt and its soft voices, he dreamed again of that tree. He went to it the way a man goes along a corridor to a room he hopes and fears to find occupied. The first nights, the carved eyes were shut. Then, one night as a wind rose and died in leaves that could not be there, the eyes were open, and there was a reflection in them of a shape passing across snow, not a bird and not a cloud. He woke with his hand to his throat. not because he could not breathe, but because he could not easily find where he kept the breath he needed. Sometimes, as he sat with Howland on the flat stones where fish were gutted, Howland would look at him sidelong and ask a question that had nothing to do with the day. "How long do you think a name is, boy?" Or, "What kind of fire burns in the part of you that does not go out when your body does?" Robb would try to answer and Howland would nod, and sometimes he would smile with half his mouth and sometimes he would not. "They say the dragons are dead," Robb said one evening when the fog had drawn a net under the sky and the moorporks were calling from the bleached stumps like men with secrets. He had not meant to say it, not yet, but the words had arrived and sat at his throat until he gave them their due. "My father told me that when I was a boy. He told me of men who rode them once, and of the balance of fear that held the realm. I was afraid of them until I realized they were ash." Howland was plucking something stringy and edible from a bundle of reeds. "It comforts men to think all the old things are settled," he said. "We pretend we live in the last part of a story, but we are always in the middle of it. My father told me of dragons who liked the marsh once, when the Moor Kings were men whose word ran like a river instead of sticking in their throats. He told me of a night when the sky was bright and there were shadows against it. We learned to read shadows here. They say much about a thing. They tell you there is a light." Robb had not meant dragons when he said dragons. He had meant power, mourning, something like a counterweight to the laughter that had risen above him with the torches like a wind. It was ridiculous to speak of beasts whose bones had been ground and burned and whose teeth hung in a southern castle as a memory someone could wear when he wanted applause. Still, the word was in the air now. The thought of it drew a path in his mind like a stag makes in snow, slow and inevitable. "You have a rumor in you," Howland said, as if Robb had spoken what he saw. "It breathes. It is not truth yet. If you feed it only fear, it will turn on you. If you feed it blood, it will come on a leash you cannot hold. Do not think you can call what you do not honor." "I honor my people," Robb said, too quickly. "I do not doubt it," Howland said mildly. "That is not the question I asked." Robb looked down at his hands. The scars had taken on their own map. He moved his fingers one by one, and each called up something else. A face, a night, a piece of bread he had given and not stolen. "I want them safe," he said after a while, because if he spoke of vengeance the word would bring with it the drunkards from the hall and he would not be able to stand the noise. "I want them not to be at the mercy of men like—" He did not say the name. "I want the North to be a place where people can keep their words without having their throats cut for it." "Good," Howland said. He set aside the bundle and wiped his hands on his thighs. "Begin with that. The rest is smoke. Smoke can be useful. It hides men when they must hide, and it carries scent when you need to know who burns. But it will not warm you." In the nights that followed, the rumor grew a spine. It was not born out of tales of far shores or the bright, polite horror that southern minstrels peddled when they wanted a lady to press a hand to her chest. It grew from the reed houses and the memory of the grove and men's care in naming things. The marsh people spoke of a place where the earth had been taught a different alphabet, a bay where stones were black and glossy and sound carried as if it did not wish to be heard. Sometimes, on a morning after a storm, the sky would be clear beyond what seemed possible. The air was washed, and a shadow would cross the grass in a way that could not be a cloud. The old folk did not look away when that was said. They did not send the children out or draw them near, either. They offered the fact like a bowl of good soup and then let it cool on the table. West of the Wolf Coast, a woman told him as she prepared something that was both soup and not, the way many marsh things were both then neither. "Not a place for men with iron in them. It brings the iron out as if that were what it had to do. Best to go with bone and glass if you go. Best to go with a song and be willing to change its tune when the air tells you. You have iron, boy, but you also have a voice. A king is only a singer with armies. You may do better as a singer with marsh." In the long afternoons of the fog months, he learned the song of a boat that glides without wake and the song of a blade that does not reflect the moon. He learned to tell when a marsh was breathing in and when it was breathing out. He learned, too, what it was to keep silence without resentment, because silence was not an absence here but a different conversation. when he could sit his spear steady and make it sing through the water true enough that an eel, thoughtless and sinuous as sin, rose to see what had already claimed it, Howland came and sat. He brought with him a bundle wrapped in hide that had a smell like old coins, salt, and something that had been waiting for someone's hands. He unwrapped it without ceremony. In his lap lay a length of black stone worked cunning as any southern smith could work gold. A shard more than a blade, with a ripple in it like frozen water. Beside it, something round wrapped in a net of leather and tiny knots like a man had tried to keep a child from rolling away and the child had agreed only halfway. "You know what this is," Howland said. He did not make it a question. "Dragon glass," Robb said. He did not touch it. The shard drank the little light and held only enough to be meagerly polite. The knotted round thing might have been a weight or a charm or a piece of the world no man owned. "We call it the Moor's teeth," Howland said. "It has bitten what it has bitten and will not tell. When you hold it, you will remember something you have never known. That is the only truth I have for you that I can stand by. This, though," he added, touching the netted round with the back of a finger, "has not a name because I don't know it yet. I know only how it felt when my father carried it and did not know he was carrying it, and when he set it down and the room did not sound the same. That is how I know it is something in the world and not a fairy's fart." Robb almost smiled. The marsh people had a way of cutting words to a size he could carry. "Where did you get it?" "I told you we would go west of the Wolf Coast," Howland said, as if they had both been present when he had uttered this. "I told you there is a place where a man with iron in him must leave it on a stone and owe the stone a favor. There are caves there, not deep ones, cuts in a black shore like someone made a handful of slits with a careful knife. In one, 3 of these lay. They had the look of stone eggs. They were not heavy enough. They were not light enough. They are what they are. I am old enough to know when something insists on itself. We kept them. We did not break them because we did not know if they were ours to break. We did not lay them in fire because we understood fire to belong to them and not them to fire." "So," Robb said. The quiet inside him suddenly taut as a bow held full drawn. "They're eggs." "How would I know?" Howland said softly. "When I see a nest, I do not put my fingers into it and then declare what the eggs are. I stand near it and see if the parent comes. If there is no parent, I consider how long the nest has been quiet, and whether I ought to put the eggs out of their misery or my curiosity out of mine. If our forebears broke all the eggs, we would not have eels to stew. If they sat on all the eggs, the marsh would be a living rug." Robb took a breath he had not realized he had been saving. He reached out and touched the net. The thing in it was smooth and irregular, like something that had been molten and then chosen to keep the shape of the moment it remembered most. It gave off no heat. It gave off a promise that neither comforted nor threatened. When he drew his hand back, he was shaking. "You have blood that is not only yours," Howland said. "All men do, but some men have it tied into more knots. Your blood remembers. It remembers iron, snow, a girl's laugh on a day when ashes did not show yet, and it remembers the voice of a man whose head met the earth faster than he deserved. It may also remember fire. Do not think that is a guarantee that you can put your mouth to a coal and sing. It is only a chance the world offers to a man who is stubborn and not entirely foolish." "You said there are 3, Robb said. "Where are the others?" "In a place where they will not hear you call until you decide what your voice is," Howland said. "You want revenge. That is a narrow voice. It has a range. Can bring a certain kind of dog. Cannot bring a stalking cat. Cannot bring a swan. You will need a kinder tune. I know you do not want to hear this. Hear it anyway." "I want them to pay," Robb said, and the sentence did not bring him the satisfaction he'd thought it would. "Make them pay in a currency you can live with," Howland said. "Copper is no good. It stains the fingers. Gold is a dream in a drunkard's mouth. Pay them in distance and in the knowledge that you will not be cut again in the same place. Pay them by living. Let that be the insult. If you must add heat to it, choose your fire." "How?" Howland smiled. "You are a king in this room. You can ask me how, and I will give you a list of things that make me feel wise for a day. Or you can decide to go to the black shore and kneel with your head to the stone and listen until your bones hate you. That is how. In the way of the marsh people, the decision did not have a day. It was made of nights and breath. Robb let the hum of it settle near his heart the way a man lets a spark sit in the middle of tinder. He walked slower and he slept in shorter slices. He ate whatever he was given and tasted in it always a piece of the shore he had not yet seen. Nella had been gone for weeks. Some mornings he thought of her and it felt like thinking of a rope he had gripped in a storm and then given back to the boat. He carried the thought like a white scar. At last Howland came and stood, and that was the sign he would have asked for if he were allowed to ask for signs. The older man with his face set toward a direction and his hands empty. "We go with the water," Howland said. "Not the land. We leave what can find us too easily. We carry little. What you leave here keeps you. What you take will betray you if you do not know its true name." They went at dawn, which the marsh does not honor as an event many days but gave them that day as a favor. The mist had the transparent look it gets when the sun, if there is one, will be obliged. 2 men and a boy came with them, their hair cut bird short and their wrists tattooed with thin bands that looked like they had been put there while the men laughed. The boat was lower and wider than Robb preferred. It sat the water like something teach. It had grown in it. They ate while they went. Food was not a thing that stopped you here. Food went with you in strips and lumps and strange shakes. The boat slid along the long veins. Robb learned what it is to pass through places without having your presence change them. That, he learned, is a kind of strength different from banners or walls. He did not speak. Howland did not either. He had learned the rhythms of silence here, and this one was the silence that builds pressure. They made the Wolf Coast in 3 nights and a day that had known better ones. It was a broken line of stones, like the teeth in a skull that had been kicked once too often. The water was salt and unforgiving, and the wind had its blades out. Here the marsh had no voice, and in its place there was the memory of the sea's songs, which are many and very few. They skirted the shore where it showed its greed, and then took the boat in under a lip of rock where the water had to curl itself thin to pass. They brought no fire. The shore would have noticed. They brought bone knives and black glass spearheads and a bundle wrapped in oilskin that told the wind nothing of what was in it. They brought the leather net with the round thing in it, because it seemed discourteous not to let it see whatever waited here for it. Robb stepped onto the black stone, and it took him. It was not a dramatic thing. It did not open under him or sing. It recognized the weight of a man who had come to listen. That is enough for any place. He nearly fell because the black glass was slick and oddly sticky at once, with a feel of heat that was not temperature. He found a way of placing his feet that would let him remain walking and adopted it, and their little party moved into the cuts that had been made by sea and not by any man alive. The caves were simple. That was their grandeur. They did not need to be large or branching. They asked you to recognize them as what they were, and that is a more difficult task than men imagine. The first cut was just a cleft where wind had made a path for itself. The second had a floor that rose as it went, until it made a shelf where a man could sit and think his thoughts without being insulted by the rest of the world. The third, Howland paused there and set his hand to the stone and breathed. "This one," he said. They went in single file. Robb left his shoes where the stone suggested it and went barefoot, and instantly it was easier to understand. The floor had a rhythm it wished for. If you moved your feet as if you were sliding your palms down the flanks of a sleeping horse, the stone accepted your weight with something like gratitude. At the heart of it, if a simple cut has a heart, was a bowl made by someone clever who understood that the sea can be asked for favors if you don't forget to give it something first. In the bowl, the black glass curved inward and upward like the inside of a skull turned to face itself. There the 3 lay, not hatching, not sleeping, not anything that men usually can make words for without choosing sides. They were smoother than they had any right to be. One had a sheen in the low light like mother of pearl made from soot. One was pale, not white but the idea of white, the suggestion of frost on stone. The last was the color of old water when you look at it from underneath. Robb went to his knees without meaning to. He did not see either of the marshmen who had come begin to bow in place with that peculiar ease of body people have when they have lived in a place that will not forgive stiffness. He did not see Howland set his hand on the rim of the bowl and then take it away again as if he had been burned. He saw the three. He heard a wind that did not exist in the cave. He smelled that flavor again, metal and cinnamon and a little of something like a struck coin tastes to a child. He did not reach for them. That was a victory he earned minute by minute while his hands itched as if they had been stung. He made his breath regular. He remembered his mother's voice the morning she had last smoothed his hair and said nothing she needed to say aloud. He remembered Gray Wind's shoulder under his hand, warm and alive and proud enough to be gentle. He remembered the hall and chose to set that memory down like a knife he would pick up again when the cutting was the right kind. Howland's palm brushed the back of his neck and then left it. "If these were only stones," Howland said softly, "you could pick them up and throw them into the sea. People have done that for other things. If they are not, then they deserve more courtesy than most men give most gods. I ask you to decide who you are before you touch them." "I am a man whose mother died while he lived," Robb said hoarsely. "I am a man who was called a king and did not finish the song. I am a boy who broke an oath and a soldier who kept others. I am the North's son. I am." Howland waited. The waiting became a thing you could lean on. "I am not finished," Robb said at last, and the tears that came then were not the tears of a child but the tears of someone whose life had sprung a leak at a depth he could not reach to patch from the outside. "Good," Howland said. "Then it remains to be seen what else you will be." They stayed until the light changed and then changed again. That was time in this place, a tide through stone. They did not press their flesh to the round things and demand they do as they were told. They sat, and when Robb's hunger became a polite complaint in his belly, they ate in very small amounts so the cave would not fill with the smell of their need. The round things did not move. They did not crack. A man could have felt foolish. Robb did not. He felt his blood in his wrists like a march of men. He felt something in his chest lift its head and open one eye, and he did not order it back to sleep. When darkness came that would not be argued with, they left. They made their beds on the black shore with the wind like a dog trying to find a place to lie down. They did not make fire. They told no stories. Sleep had the same depth here it had in the marsh, and yet when morning pressed cold fingers under the rim of the sky and the world made that small sound it makes when it decides to start breathing again, Robb was awake without having fallen asleep that any way he could name. They returned to the cave. There was a difference he could not name. People with bad luck call such things omens. People with better luck call them mornings. He put his hand to the rim of the bowl. The stone did not object. Howland stood behind him like the idea of company. The marsh men flanked him like patience given legs. He touched the black glossed one first, with the pads of 2 fingers. Cold, as if it had swallowed heat and now held it in the way a vault holds treasure. He touched the pale one next. It felt less like a rock, more like something that knew what a hand was. The last, the watercolored, stung him. A biting little kiss that made him pull back with a laugh he did not plan, and he saw Howland's smile in the edge of his sight. The sting was not pain. It was acknowledgement. He drew his knife not because knives solve everything, but because sometimes blood needs help to find the air. He lifted the blade and then stopped. It was the first time since he had seen the 3 that the decision was returned entirely to him. He put the knife away. Howland's brow arched. Barely. "I have spilled enough," Robb said. "If they want me, they can take something else first." He unwrapped the leather net that had carried the 4th in the bundle. The round thing in it caught the cave's mean light and made something of it that was not generous but not greedy either. He put it beside the 3, where a mother of something might have put a 4th. It did not roll. He put his hand on the stone again, and when he took it away, his palm left a smear that was not entirely sweat. The stone took that as it had taken everything they had failed or tried to give it. The air shifted once like a big animal resettling itself. Nothing else happened. He let the disappointment pass through him and go out his breath like a fish does when it drifts away from a broken net. In the night, though, when no one spoke and the shore held its razor in a friendly way for once, wind shifted. It came from the west with a smell that made the inside of his teeth itch and a sound that made the hair on his arms stand. He sat up and the marshmen did not, because they did not sit up when they did not have to. Howland rolled onto an elbow and watched him with the calm reserved for children doing something both necessary and ridiculous. Robb went to the mouth of the cave and sat where he had sat the first day. He put his palm to the glass. It was warmer by a hair. He brought his ear down to it because he had no dignity to protect that hour. He heard nothing but his own blood and the sea's pretend snoring. He sat until the light put a blade into the cave and drew it back again, and then he sat until the blade returned and went. He had not moved when Howland brought him a strip of fish and a lump of barley kneaded into a cake that had the mercy of being easier to swallow than pride. On the third day a storm came. The Black Shore liked storms. The wind wrote its name on everything and then pretended it had not. The rain came in sheets and then in knives and then in handfuls. The cave mouth took the spray and turned it into pearls for a moment before they fell and grew ugly. They could not have left then if they had wanted to. The storm asked them to prove they meant to be here. They did not stand and shout and vow. They lay low with their backs to the stone and they breathed its damp. It was near dusk when the first crack came, and it was not a crack. It was a change in air, a scent of iron singed and something like fennel but deeper. Robb was on his feet before he knew that he was moving. Howland put a hand to his arm and for once did not encourage or restrain. He was only there, like a tree is there when you choose to lean. There was a sound like a not giving. The pale one had a new line across it, hairfine, then wider. Under the thin shell of whatever it was, a glow that was not light made itself known like a child testing a language. Robb's heart was an animal that wanted to run. He stood and let it run in circles in his chest. The second line appeared. The third invited itself. There is a point at which even a man who has decided not to hope becomes hope's servant again. Robb bowed his head. When the crack widened enough to make a little breath of heat, the cave's air took it and carried it like a housewife with a cup on her head. The storm breathed then, as if it had received something and was unsure what it had been given. With each small grim sound the pale shell made a different smell. Burnt coins, pine, a suggestion of snow in summer, a trick he had not thought possible to scent. His eyes stung and the water on his face could have been from the storm. "How much?" he asked, and the question was to the shell, the storm, his own courage. "As much as you give it," Howland said simply. He offered it secrecy first. He did not cry out when the first sliver came away and showed not flesh but a tight, damp fold of what? That had a nap like fine leather and a sheen like a frog's back. He did not reach. He let the thing inside decide its own speed. It was not a human child. It needed no midwife's urgency. For all that, his body remembered watching births in rough tents where men convinced themselves he was not there and wept like drunks afterward. He had learned then not to clap when breath finally came. The first head that pushed out was not really a head at all. It was a blunt suggestion with eyes not open. The hole widened, and then what came forth was so neither beautiful nor ugly that it made the words fly backwards into their cages. The CR. Eacher was pale, not white. Snow after a scorched field. Bone pulled from a river, not bleached, still singing itself under the mouth of the world. It was small. It was big in the way that stars seem. It was not a story yet. It was pure fact, and for that he nearly fell to his knees again. Coughed. That was the word, ridiculous and human, and yet it was what happened. A little gulping hack, as if the storm had gone down the wrong way. It blinked. Its eyes were a color he had no word for, a gray that had eaten a piece of green and not digested it. It uncurled, and the wet nap of its hide adjusted to air and became, when he later chose words to hang on it, a kind of armor that did not look like armor, a smoothness that would only look like scales if you wished it to. The sound it made when it first opened its mouth had no heat in it and plenty. It was not a cry. It was the thing's opinion of the day. Howland's hand closed on his arm, and he realized only then that he had brought his hand to his chest and had pressed there hard enough to leave his own mark. "What will you call it?" Howland asked, his voice unsteady for the first time since Robb had known him. "That you can be forgiven for?" Robb understood the weight of that question in a way he would not have months ago. You could name a thing and add a piece of yourself to it without meaning to, and then you would have to chase yourself when it ran. He swallowed. He thought of his father, and then he thought, no. Names of the dead are a weight on the living. He thought of snow and found that word too simple. He thought of smoke and found it too southern. He thought of wolves. The creature blinked and regarded him with an interest that was not love yet and not indifference. It had been born into a room where men meant things. It would make its own decisions about those meanings. "Sky Song," he said at last, and the marsh men shifted in place as if the syllables had a weight that had landed on their pooled bodies. "If it must have another that I can say when I have blood in my mouth, Ash." The creature tasted the air with a tongue that looked like a ribbon made of frost with a muscle under it. It took a step that was not elegant and did not need to be. It came to the rim of the bowl and looked down at the sea as if it had never seen it before and found it already amusing itself on a stone. It made no move to fly. It did not know how. It turned back to him, as if to note who else had been present at its first look at the world. It was not as if a rope were thrown to him from a wall. It was not a bond. It was the first moment of a posture people take when they are in the presence of something they realize can hurt them or save them or do neither and still determine the shape of their next decisions. Robb put his hand out low and flat, as he would for a horse who had been wronged by other hands. The creature came and put its blunt nosing mouth under his palm and made a little peal of breath that steamed and did not. Heat pricked his skin, then withdrew with a discipline a better man than he would practice every day. He laughed with all his good heart. It was the first time he had heard the sound out of himself without guilt since his father had been taken from a high place by a low man. He looked at Howland and found his eyes were full to the brim with water not entirely of this sky. Howland nodded once, profoundly, and then, uncharacteristically, clapped his shoulder. Pain shot through him and did not matter. The storm, like a cat who had been entertained and now was not, went away. In its wake, the air was fresh in the sort of way that makes you feel you have been mistaken about the smell of air your whole life. Outside the cave, the shore had arranged itself slightly differently. Stones that had been here had moved. Stones that had not seemed to be now were. The marsh men made small, satisfied noises and put their hands to the cave walls as if they had been gone a long time and were returned. The second did not hatch that day. The third did not either. Patience is a blade and a bowl. You cut and hold with it. Robb learned it again in that cave. He learned to sit with a thing that had eyes like river rock and let it be where it was. The creature ate twice, barely. A mouthful offered in a manner he would later name a mistake and correct. Howland guided his hand away when he would have given more. "You feed it your need, it will take that instead of food," he said. "Let it be hungry. Let it own what you do not." They did not try to tame what could not be tamed. They looked. They listened. They learned what the small change in the air meant and what the small piston in the throat did in the moment before the creature made its knot cry. They learned how often it blinked. They learned it like damp. They learned nothing that would turn into a trick. In the night after, when the first had taken itself to the lip of the bowl and arranged itself there like a question mark, Robb dreamed again. He was under the tree. His eyes were open. They looked past him and around him as if they had always known to do that. There were shadows on the snow again, more of them this time. He understood in the dream that what he had done in the cave was not unnatural in the way the southern boys at court would say if they tried to believe in gods while keeping their hair oil out of their collars. It was simply an older language, one that men had stopped speaking because it is hard work to learn to shape your mouth to it and because it gives you less power than it gives the world. He woke with his hands stretched out in air as if he had been trying to touch something just beyond it. They stayed a week. On the 5th day, the Dark One took a crack. It was not jealous. It did not hurry. It opened itself in a different manner, with more sound, and what came forth had a sheen to it that would later take on oil in a way that made torches love it too much. It was smaller than the first, and it was quicker. It went to the lip of the bowl at once. It regarded the sea and did not dignify it with much attention. It went to Robb then and looked through him like a summer sky looks through a fly. He did not take offense. They named it Tide Rank then, because it seemed to have already chosen to be the thing against which other things needed measuring. He called it rank for short, because it insisted, and this amused Howland more than Robb had ever seen him amused, laughing in a low, true way that made the cave seem less hard. The third sat uncracked and might have sat until frost took it from the inside for all Robb knew. He learned in that waiting something he would use later when men pressed him with their impatience. He learned to tell the difference between readiness and boredom. He learned that his body could contain desire and not let it devour him. He learned that he could love an outcome without liking the pace that led there and not go mad. When they left the Black Shore, the world was greener for it. The marsh took them back as a mother takes back a child who has been gone and learned the smell of other kitchens. Robb felt his feet find their old music, and yet it had a new measure. He was going back to the reed houses and their slanted floors and their low, generous ceilings and the smoke that turned into a particular shape near a particular beam when a north wind pushed it. He was not going back to the boy he had been before he had watched a pale creature think with its eyes. In the weeks that followed, he learned to build a drift of secrecy that was not lie but not truth told too soon. He did not speak of Skysong as if they were a pet. He spoke of work. The marsh folk had no hunger for gossip. Their hunger was for fish and for quiet. For all that, old women who had cooked him soups stood outside their doorways and nodded once as he passed, slow and grave, as if to say that they had known the shape of this day when he had arrived and they were satisfied he had learned enough not to make it dangerous. Children peered from behind hanging reed mats and hid again with shrieks that had nothing of fear. The young men watched him, not with awe or resentment, but with that sharp look that says, "You are not the only one who has gone out and come back with something on your hands." The eggs, they were eggs now. He allowed himself to own the word, sat in their nest of black glass and river wool in a chamber that had no windows and a roof that was watched very carefully by old men when storms came. Skysong grew at the pace of fire and not at the pace of trees. Spells, the South would have said. Work, the marsh said. Robb took meat to the creature and let it steal from him the way an uncle lets a child take a coin from behind his own ear. He learned what was too much and what was cruel. He could not have said how afterward. It was a knowledge of small numbers and someone else's patience. Sometimes, at evening, when the fog rose soft and sweet as milk and the marsh took back every edge, he would sit with Howland and the others on flat, hauled stones and listen to a woman sing. Her voice had a crack in it, and the crack had a story. She did not mend it. She put the songs through that place and told them truths they would not otherwise have owned. Robb remembered Nella then until his remembering hurt him more than his shoulder ever had. He sent it down into the place where he kept things he must not set down. He promised himself that if the world gave him a day when it would not be treason to go, he would put bread in her hand and see if she would laugh with her whole mouth or only half. By winter's thin edge, when the marsh water began to consider skinning over in mornings and little birds hopped on the ice and discovered it was not yet committed, Rank had taken to climbing, in its own ungraceful way, along the ribbed supports of the reed house where the nest had been built. It hung upside down sometimes in a manner that made Robb's stomach remember heights and fall. He learned that the little dart of flame that came when Rank sneezed was nothing to fear if he did not make it a thing to fear. He learned to carry water always and to keep a wet hide at hand and to speak calmly in smoke. He learned to put his head under a reed mat and breathe as if he were a fish when he had to. He learned to command with a hand and not a shout. The unhatched waited. Howland said no more about it than he had said about the first. "There is a reason for everything," he said once when Robb's glance lingered too long and too obviously on the remaining shell. "That is the lie men tell to avoid grief. There is no reason yet. There may not be. You can live with that, or you can turn yourself into a hook and hang on it until you cut through the beam that holds the house." Robb nodded and was ashamed of the way relief and despair both liked the shape of his ribs then, comfortable as cats. The north whispered to him in different ways than it had before. When the wind came through the reeds with the particular sound that means snow is being born in another county and will arrive at dawn, he knew it in his shoulder and in the fall of his breath. When a man came to the reed house having walked too far on legs that had not had enough argument with a bed, Robb saw it in his eyes and put a kettle on before he offered him a place. The skills of a king, he thought in bleak humor, and then caught himself thinking like a child who had been wronged. He laughed at the thought and thought that meant he was healing. He did not forget. Forgetting is a muscle some grow, but his had never learned to move to that beat. News came in little boats. Men crossed the neck on their way to other men, and they stopped as a matter of courtesy to offer a stitch of the world's cloth and to take one of fish or advice. He learned of lords who had shouted his name like a raft as it floated out of their reach, and then taken the names of other men like dry bread and tried to chew. He learned that in cold halls men sat behind their cups and talked of what they would have done differently if they had been the ones with their hands on a war. He heard, now and then, the name of the place where his mother had given her last song, and he answered it by going to the room where the creatures lay and sitting very quiet until the word moved through him without tearing. The first time Sky Song climbed from the nest to the sill and put its head out into the air without walls, Robb felt a piece of his heart go with it. The thing did not fall. It did not fly either. Tasted the marsh. Found it acceptable. It put its weight on the air and discovered that the air would carry some, in the way a lazy ant will carry a child for a while when no one asks her to, and put it down without apology when she is done. It learned falling and rising and the difference between the two, and it came back to the reed house with its sides working and its mouth open in a silent pant, and it went to the nest and slept as if the world were finished with it. Robb sat beside it with one hand on the edge of the black glass and one on his knee, and he let sleep touch him without taking him. When he began to speak again of leaving the marsh, of coming through the neck as a piece of weather and then taking the old roads north, his voice had not the tremor of revenge. It had the steadiness of frost. He would have to go. The marsh had held him and taught him and lent him names and brought him to a piece of the old world breathing. It was not his forever. He was their guest. To remain past a certain season would be to put roots out where he had no right to, and roots are not easier to pull for being shallow. He would carry what he had learned into a land that did not know it needed it. He would carry Sky Song. He would carry rank. He would carry the third unhatched's quiet and his own patience and his mother's last breath and Nella's hard laugh and the way Howland put his hand on his shoulder without ownership. "Go before the water decides to make you a remembrance," Howland said when the first true ice had come and then gone away, embarrassed at its thinness. "You won't take a road. You will go where the roads wish to be. When men ask your name, tell the truth only if you can feed the truth behind it afterward. Do not be a man whose name kills his next meal. Do not be a man whose name chokes the person saying it. And if you stand in a hall again when bread is brought, say the names of the seeds inside it before you put it in your mouth." He smiled when he said that, and Robb smiled back because it was absurd and true and a thing a man could anchor to when banners blew over him like thunderheads and he did not have time to count them. He packed what the marsh gave him. A cloak that had learned the trick of turning rain into something social. A knife that had been made by a boy who had not yet decided if he would marry the girl who laughed at him in the evenings. A bow of reed and sinew that would break if he tried to make it a longbow and would serve him perfectly well if he respected its different idea of what a bow should be. He packed nothing he did not intend to use every day or to give to someone who would. The day he left, he stood in the door of the reed house where the three had been and stood already for other men as a place to breathe. Sky Song was draped along the top beam like a shawl a grandmother puts away in summer and then gets out on a day with nostalgia in it. Rank hung upside down because Rank liked to see things in a manner other people did not. The third was a quiet stone on the bed of its black nest. Robb went and put a hand on each. He did not make speeches. He did not promise not to break what he could not possibly keep unbroken. He said in his chest what would have embarrassed him out of it if anyone had heard. The marsh was mourning again. The fog was a friendly little insult around their ankles. The boat waited. Howland stood in it without moving the boat, which was a kind of sorcery the South would never recognize. The marsh men were there and not there because that was their way. The children had eaten and had already forgotten him, which is the mercy the world throws us sometimes. The old woman who had sung the songs put her hand on his cheek as if he were a bowl of soup she was testing for heat and then let it fall back to her side. He stepped into the boat. Something in his chest stepped onto a road that he would not see for days. He held the little chain of the creature's harness. He had made it himself with the help of a boy whose hands were more patient than his. It was made to slip and to break when breaking was the kinder thing. He did not plan to lead with it. He planned to let it trail like a note after a song. He thought once, as the reeds gave way to the slow moans of trees and then to the blunt shoulders of old stone in the water's path, of the hall, the torches, the laughter, came less sharp than it had, came like weather. It would always be weather. He could not ask it to be less. He could decide to carry a roof. He looked behind him only once, which was a victory anyone who has left home will tell you is rarer than men boast. The reed house stood as it stood. Howland's face was a door left open. Robb lifted a hand. He did not wave. He saluted with 2 fingers like a man who knows he will see another at some time and is content with that as a promise. Howland inclined his head like a man to whom promises are complicated and precious. They went. The marsh gave them to the neck, and the neck, which has not forgotten what it is to take men in and send men out different, laid a thin skin over the water, and Robb put the bow of the boat through it like the first sentence of a serious song. The creatures breathed smoke like children in cold mornings. Somewhere ahead lay the old roads and tea. Men who had taken his mother's song and turned it into a necklace for a bad joke. Somewhere lay halls where bread would be offered and bread would be refused. And somewhere lay a tree whose eyes were open, and above a snowfield, maybe, a shadow that would not accept the shapes it had been told were the only possible ones. He did not think of dragons as weapons then. He thought of them as breath. He thought of them as heat that would hold people through nights they should not have to spend alone in barns. He thought of them as the old world making an argument for itself in a tongue he had been forced to learn and found he loved. Later, there would be fire enough for men who had built halls out of other men's promises and then sat drinking under the bones. Now, there was the stroke of oars, the shock of cold on his face, the knowledge that the marsh had trusted him to carry a fire more difficult than a torch. On the second day of the going, when the land narrowed them to a place where a man on either bank could throw a stone and hit the other if he had since childhood nothing better to do than practice, a boy with more bones than flesh on him looked up from a catch of river insects his sister was trying to convince him were supper and saw the pale creature on the beam of the boat. He did not shout. He simply stood and forgot to close his mouth. His sister cuffed him, then saw too, and the 2 of them stood with their hands in the water because when the world widens, hands do not always know they should come out of it. Robb lifted a hand to them, palm forward, and the girl, after a moment, lifted hers. The pale thing cocked its head in that broken, birdish way and exhaled a thread of steam. The boy laughed a single honest syllable. For long minutes after, as they pulled away, Robb felt that laugh ride in the boat like a passenger they could not see. By the time they smelled the stone where Moat Cailin sank its black teeth into the ways, the creatures had learned to make the air a thing of use rather than a thing that ignored them. Sky Song took 3 flaps in a row that did not put the world under him into a panic. Rank discovered that wind does not obey anyone and laughed a silent, arrogant laugh that made the hairs on Robb's arms stand up again. He wondered if the road over the causeway would taste the heat and remember its own. Perhaps. Some things in the north were not as asleep as men thought. They made camp under a piece of earth held up by the roots of a tree that had not yet decided if it wanted to live or die. Howland had left them at a bend in the river weeks ago, because the marsh had other work for him, and because unaccompanied journeys teach men to carry themselves and not always ask someone else for a hand up. Robb found he missed the quiet of the older man not as grief but as you miss water when you have been lucky all day and have not had to sweat. He slept with his hand on the leather chain as if it were a pulse he needed to keep time with. Once in the night the creatures stirred and he woke and lay listening to them breathe. He realized that his life had learned a new measure of safety. He did not trust it. He did not kick it away. He let it put a corner of its blanket over him, and then he put the other corner over the creatures. In the morning a wind came off the stones that had a voice like men arguing over dice. He rose and stretched and felt the tug of his shoulder and kissed it with his mind because pain that stays is a friend, even when it is not pleasant company. He ate a piece of meat that had dried itself into the memory of having once been good, and he chewed the memory and was nourished all the same. He put his hand on the creature's flank. Sky Song had become a word he could say and not feel that he was using the wrong language. The flank rose and fell. The eye opened and closed again. He thought of the girl then, Nella, standing in a slip of water with her shift clinging to her thighs and the torchlight above like a cruel sermon. He thought of her walking back into that hall with her mouth tight and her hands dirty. He thought of the fact that he had no way of paying her what he owed yet, and he understood that debt for the first time as something you honor by not forgetting and not by tormenting yourself. He folded her laughter into the same place where he kept the image of his mother's hand in the air at the last, and he told himself, aloud into the morning's thinness, that he would add breath to both those women's names when the day came that he could do something with that breath. Then he turned his face to the north and stepped where the old road had once been and now was only a suggestion under the reeds. He went at a pace that wanted to be faster and was not. The creatures moved like two kinds of weather beside him. He did not take their speed as his. He took their presence as a thing the day had decided to include. He knew men ahead would try to take what he carried. He knew he might fail. He knew that he had made some bargains with the old world that he did not yet entirely comprehend. He knew that he was young and older than he had been at supper before the hall. He kept walking because there is no other art to it. Somewhere, a tree's eyes were open. Somewhere, a woman with a cracked voice was singing. Somewhere, a boy laughed at the sight of steam in an animal's breath and forgot how to close his mouth. Somewhere, lords sat behind thick bread and thought their plans were better than someone else's plans. Somewhere far, men who had thought they had sealed a future in a private room would hear a piece of news that would salt their butter. Somewhere, a pale creature put its head under a leaf because rain had decided to argue with it, and a young man with scars his clothes could not cover reached out and said a name he had made himself and was not ashamed to own aloud. Robb Stark walked into the country that had made him and had been made ill by his absence. Fog gathered and drifted. Reeds bowed and then stood again. The creatures matched him, one aloof and quick, one thoughtful and gentle, the third quiet as a held breath in the harness. Winter would have its say, and then another season would interrupt politely and then not. He would speak to old stones and be spoken to by things with no mouths. He would do harm and then do less of it and learn, and he would come upon doors that were not doors and put his hand through them like water. There would be a day when men who had found the sound of laughter sweet when it was sharpened with malice would look up at a shadow crossing not only a courtyard but a way of living, and they would feel in their teeth a taste they had not known since they were children held up to windows to see a bright thing passing. But that lay then. Now his breath, the oars of his body, the cautious song of sky song finding a thermal when there should not be one, ranks inverted view, the unhatched's quiet. The north drew its long, unhurried breath, and the old world leaned down to smell the crown of a head it remembered and had not seen in that shape before. He made no promises he could not keep to the air, the earth, the creatures, or himself. He said what he could say, and that was enough. Not yet, but soon. On the third morning, the fog stood higher than his knees, and the reeds made a soft crowding sound around the hull. The old road lay under water like a memory. Still there, but you had to feel it rather than trust your eyes. Robb kept the oars close and slow. The creatures watched the water as if it were making promises. Rank hung from the thwart by both hind talons, upside down, turning their narrow head in tiny, precise increments to track whiskered ripples. Sky Song had taken to riding the bow like a chilled cat, forelimbs tucked, the long tail pressed to the shallow curve of the prow, eyes half-lidded against the raw air. The third lay in its net, quiet as a winter seed. He learned the poles of the causeway by touch and sound. When the hull dragged over an old stone, his teeth rang, and he listened for the pitch of grinding. There was a way stones spoke to the bottom of a boat that told you whether to push or to wait. He chose waiting more than a younger self would have. He did not count that as age. He counted it as obedience to the place he was in. Toward midday the wind remembered that it existed and made a show of it between the ragged gray of two drowned towers. Birds startled, rose, and then sat down on water again as if they were too tired to pretend they understood the performance. He passed a low-knuckled shape of land that would, in a kinder country, have been called a hill. Here it was simply a place the mud had decided not to swallow for the time being. A child's song drifted from it. 2 notes, repeated, then a third that surprised him with its minor turn. He lifted his head, searching. 2 figures stood close to the water. The boy had a stick with a loop of bent rush at the end. which he dipped and flicked to snare water skeeters. The girl, taller by a head, watched the stick's path and made the song automatic with her mouth. When they noticed the boat and the pale shape on the bow, both of them paused in the same instant. The pause of small people who have learned to see without being seen. The boy's stick drooped. The girl's song stopped in the middle of a note. Robb did not call out. He was a man in a boat with things the world had called dead and dangerous both, though most had not seen them. He lifted his hand, palm outward, the way he had done yesterday for another pair. The girl lifted hers back, curious, grave. Sky Song lifted their head, snuffed, and released a curl of steam from wide, unfinished nostrils. The boy laughed once, a burst, as if a bird had flown in his mouth. The girl cuffed him lightly and put her palm on his head and left it there until he remembered to close his mouth. They watched him pass with that bright stillness children use when the world brings them something they'll want to carry around inside their heads for a long time. After the children were behind, the reeds ran like a wide comb. The land grew less patient with water and began to show itself in patches of clay and old stone that stuck out at angles like bones. He saw, up ahead, a gray shape with a broken crown. One of the causeway's watchtowers, sunk to its shoulders. During a gentler year someone had painted a mark on it in pitch, 3 long lines like fingers. The pitch had weathered to a smooth, dull brown that looked soft and was not. He skirted it because the current wanted to steal him into the snag of protruding timbers it hid. By dusk, Moat Caelin's teeth lodged in the horizon. Their black was not the rich black of new rain or deep pine. It was the flat refusal of old basalt. He could taste iron when the air turned toward him. The boat rocked in a shallow trough and then steadied. He brought the bow around to a strip of earth that looked like a place to choose not to land and landed there because it was the least poor option. The ground took his weight reluctantly and then owned it. He walked the boat up with the stern rope and laid the line around a stump that might have been a root once and was now an idea of a post. He did not make a fire. The wind coming down the long old road had knives in it and a language as old as men, and it did not like fires that had not asked its permission. He ate standing, his cloak close, the food in hand before the cold could speak to it. The creatures ate in their fashion. Sky Song with long, precise bites, Rank with abrupt, greedy gulps followed by the long, satisfied pause of something that likes to pretend it is noble more than it likes to be. After Rank tried to hang from the loop of stern rope and found it too thick for the claws, dropped, swore in their thin, reptile way with a quick exhalation and a narrow hiss, and then glared at the rope as if it had been designed to humiliate them personally. Sky Song opened one eye to the event and closed it again, the adder-slit pupils smoothing to a soft coin as sleep lapped back over them. Robb lay with his back to a spread root and his eyes up to the strip of the world spared to stars. The causeway in the dark was less a road and more an idea. A faint lighter dark and, beyond it, the long flat black of the fawn. His breath steamed. He drew the cloak closer. Somewhere, a loon called with that sorrowing laughter that unsettles men even when they cannot see the bird. He left his mind go wide and then made it narrow the way Howland had taught him, like changing the focus of his eyes when a fish lies just under the skin of water. When he closed his eyes, he saw the inner red of the lids, then the white look of snow, then the pale of an egg that had not spoken yet. He slept and dreamed of roots. He moved among them as if he had grown there, thin and blind, turning toward water and toward the pressure of stone. There were men above the roots, and what they said did not reach him. He felt only the weight of their boots, the heat where they paused, the brief flitting tremor when a woman walked who was quick-footed and careful not to bruise the ground. A shadow crossed overhead, and the roots knew it the way roots know when a storm is making its first joke to clear its throat. It was not bird. It was not cloud. It moved with deliberation, not speed. The roots shifted minutely, a courtesy bow to something that had once been common and was not now. When he woke, his hand had turned in the leaves and pressed the heel of his palm into the earth as if to answer. He sat up and rubbed grit from the corner of one eye and then stilled, because he had not woken alone. Another sound lay under reeds and wind. A clatter, a laugh smothered, a grunt. Men not close and not far. He let the cloak stay over his chest and leaned his head as if still sleeping, moving only his eyes. Up the causeway, just visible where one of the tumbled towers made a shoulder against the sky, a sallow flame slouched and jerked with the movements of its bearer. No discipline. He counted figures not by bodies but by the pauses in the light. 1, 2, a third behind lagging, a fourth whose fire was a dark piece against the duller dark, unlit or out. They moved like men with no fear of company, which meant fear had been taken out of them or taken in and named something else. He let his breath slow. He hovered between the impulse to melt his shape into the earth and the impulse to rise and turn into the kind of man he had been taught to be when there were enemies within a bowshot. He did neither. He smoothed a hand along Skysong's back as the creature stirred at the scent of men and heat. The hide was warm to his cold palm. Not hot like a fire stone, warm like a living animal that has remembered it is built for this weather. Rank was already awake, head lifted, upside down to watch, because Rank did not take anything at the angle other people thought they should. They were four. Their boots were caked in scabbed mud. One man had a knotted rag around his elbow that had once been white. The tall one who came first wore a half coat of ring mail that had given up trying to shine. Their faces were the faces of men who had learned to eat standing up and to talk with their mouths full and to lie down wherever a wall offered itself. Not phrase. Robb knew that line of the jaw and did not see it here. Not his father's men. That was a knowledge that lived in the eyes. These were the loose stones that fall from any wall after a war. Rough men who smell where power has shifted and follow the rot. They had a cart with them, surprisingly, the wheels complaining, a low bed of boards whose corners had been strengthened more recently than the boards themselves. There was a shape on it under a cloth, large and unsteady with the jostling. Robb held himself still. The shape did not move against the jolt and clatter that made the wheels speak. He did not need to wonder long. When the wind uncoupled itself from the reeds for a breath and rushed down the long road, it lifted the cloth's corner as politely as a maid might and showed him the pale oval of a face. The eyes were covered with pennies. The mouth had that tidy last line to it. A silent sister walked behind and beside the cart, hard to see at first in her gray and her knowledge of walking at the edge of sight. The men were no escort worthy of any vow. They were an arrangement of convenience. A price taken, a small road offered in exchange for a coin and the chance of finding more to take along the way. The tall one swung the torch, careless, letting sparks fall. The second had no torch. He had a knife balanced in his palm and liked how it looked there. The third kept glancing at the sister with that false boldness men have when they are trying to convince each other they are not afraid of women who mean it. The fourth pushed at the cart as if he had been doing so since it had been built and had never had the idea that anything else would be his portion. Robb slid from under his cloak as if the ground had moved him instead of him willing to move. He did not stand in the road. He stood in the reed's edge and let the plants break his outline. He had the bough unstrung to keep the damp from arguing with the sinew, but his hands remembered the sequence of strung and knocked as easily as they remembered the feel of a hilt. He did not lift it to show himself. He spoke low in the road's language. "You can carry the dead," he said, "or you can carry fire. Choose." The tall man checked his step. It was not fear. It was the prudence of a man who has learned that sometimes the night speaks. The knife man turned, loose and laughing. The cart creaked and the fourth in it grunted because his weight had to consider the new angle. The sister did not stop. She altered not her pace and not her posture. She was water moving downhill. "Who calls?" the torchman asked, half in the tone men use when they address a ghost and half in the tone they use for a beggar they think will be amusing. "No one you want to look at close," Robb said. He let the half-beat of truth sit in the words. He still did not show himself. He wanted their attention on the place he chose, not on the pale head on his boat's bow. "Put the torch out," he said. "Wind's wrong. This road eats sparks." The tall one laughed. "This road eats men," he said and swung the brand again so that it spat spite. "What are you carrying that thinks it's a conscience?" Behind him the knife man angled toward the edge of the causeway with the slow steps of a man who pretends he is not moving and is. The third man, the one who watched the sister because he wanted to prove he did not, glanced away from her now with irritation. "Whoever you are." Sky Song made a sound that was not long and not loud. It was the small thing they did when a breath went down wrongly and heat asked for a moment to wash their throat clean. Carried in the cold. The wind lifted the sound and set it down in front of the men on the road as if it had laid a hot coin there. The knife man stopped. The torch's fire tried to lean away from its bearer and then remembered its business. The torchman turned quick toward the sound. In that turn his brand swept low over the cart. Robb did not remember telling his feet to move. The ground closed under him like a friend putting out a hand he had thought too proud to offer it. He was in the road in 3 strides. The bough came up on its own. He struck the torch with the bough's body hard and drove the fire off the cart bed. The brand made 2 quick notes in the dark, bounced, and died with a short, upset sizzle in a patch of wet moss. "Are you so starved?" he said, more heat than he had planned. "You'll cook company?" The tall man snarled and lifted his arm for a strike. The knife man had the blade back in his hand like something that had returned home. The third reached for the sister's arm and missed because she had not been there at his grasp's bottom a moment later. The fourth made a noise that had more despair in it than grudge. The sound of a man who had once known there was a better life and had forgotten how to find it. Robb did not back away. He put the bow into the tall man's arm as if it were another man's belly with a spear he had used all of his last season. He did not need to break it. He needed to make the arm remember that it had joints and that pain was a good, clear language. The man swore and dropped the arm. The knife man threw. Robb moved his cheek a fraction and the blade kissed hair and took none. He had felt it before in other nights. Sky Song came down the low angle of the boat's bow, gliding not on wings. Their wings were not yet obedient enough for that, but on intent, slipped under Robb's hand and drew up their length along his shin and thigh to make themselves tall. They opened their mouth and let a wash of heat come, not a flame, a breath that woke the night like a hand laid on the skin after ice. Men are not afraid of much. They are afraid of old things. The knife man's hand stopped as if he had put it into glue. The tall one flinched. The third made that little helpless sound men make when they see the rules had been changed and they have not been asked. The fourth only stared, his mouth open, not with wonder and not with terror, but with the blankness of a man who has been asked to consider a world he has no tools for. The sister stood as she had stood, without lifting her gaze to the creature. If she was surprised, she held it where surprise belongs when you have vowed to put the dead where they wish to be. "Put the knife down," Robb said, without anger. His voice found the old cadence it had learned in fields and tents. "Put the knife down and put your hands into the night where it can see them, and you will carry what you brought without complaint to the place she has chosen." The knife man explored in his eyes the paths between choice and injury. He set the blade down in the wet a little grudgingly, as if the ground had asked for it too politely to be entirely respected. The tall one spat. The third put his hands up because he had learned in some alley it is better to look obedient quickly than to wait to be taught. The fourth rested his palms on the back of the cart and bowed his head until his neck made a white bar in the dark. "Who are you to speak like that?" the tall one said. He was working himself back into dignity and finding it too tight. "You ride a beast that shouldn't be. You think that makes you a lord?" "No," Robb said. He was careful. "It makes me a man who will not let you burn the dead." She does not walk fast for herself. She walks for them. You can help or you can go. The road will take either. It will eat your bones easier if there's fat on them, so I would not test it. The sister raised her head at last, not to look at him but in acknowledgement that words had served. She tilted her chin toward the slope of earth that marked the largest of the moat's dry shoulders. "There," she said, and her voice was not the one people imagine when they think of women under gray cloth. It was smoke and stone and one note of old iron. "The ground has been asked for. The ground has answered. If we hurry, the wind will not fling grit into their mouths while they are sleeping." They went, then, with less argument. The tall one took the cart's front. The fourth put his back into the rear. The knife man carried the knife in his boot, because some habits are older than a night. The third walked a little behind and to the side of the sister with a bad imitation of humility and a worse imitation of gallantry. Robb went ahead, out of reach of the cart's wheels, Sky Song gliding at his boot, rank a gray slink along the outer edge, their tail leaving a long word in the night's damp. He did not put his back to any of them. He did not ask the sister where she was from or whose dead she had in her care. One face on the cart was enough truth for now. On the shoulder of earth, two men awaited more escort, or men who had seen a torch from afar and come hurrying with questions to put to it. They were wrapped in old cloaks and had staves, not spears. Working men, perhaps from a holding in the thin land north of the Fawn, who had owed a sister a kindness and were paying. They said no names. They made a little shelter of their shoulders against the wind while the sister took the cloth from the face, placed 2 fingers to the cold cheek as if reminding the flesh of itself, and then made the sign with her right hand that asserts not that there will be grace but that she hopes for it. She looked up very briefly and met Robb's gaze with an appraisal that had no curiosity in it and no heat. He had been weighed by a woman at the edge of the world. She found him to have his own weight. It was enough. After, the men worked with their staves and their hands. The ground was stingy. It wanted to keep what it had. One of the 4 from the causeway muttered and then bit off the sound. Robb dug, the pain in his shoulder clear and familiar under the effort. Sky Song sat and arranged their forepaws neatly when they saw he would be occupied a while. Rank climbed a bit of broken wall, turned upside down, and watched solemnly as if the world were a new piece of meat. When the hole was deep enough for the wind to lose interest, they put the body in. The sister took the pennies from the lids last. She held them in her palm until they were warm again and then laid them on the cloth where the head had been, as if a promise had been kept and a debt settled. When the earth was back over the body and tamped with a care that surprised Robb in men with such rough hands, the tall one met his gaze with a glance that had learned something. Not much. Something. The sister did not give thanks aloud. She did not bow. She set one hand, briefly, on the tumble of old wall and then took up the cart's handle. The men took the corners. They went without a farewell because the dead do not wait. He did not sleep after. He lay listening to the reeds speak in the small cold hours. The creatures breathed like 2 different songs, out of time and still harmonious. When pale came and then offered itself as morning, they went on. He crossed the worst of the neck like a man walking under a pond, keeping his steps shallow and his arms close. The causeway lifted itself by degrees. Trees dawned. They were not the bent willow of the marsh nor the stunted alder that makes a yellow sullen cloud in summer. They were oaks that had managed, somehow, to find a piece of ground they could put their feet into and not sink. He saw the first hawk he had seen in months, a rag of bird on a rag of sky, and felt the pull in his chest that meant the north was folding him into itself again whether he had earned it back or not. At the edge of the Fawn, rot and stone argued with each other and called it a wall. Men had built there once with more hope than cunning. Now the wall was an enthusiasm of thorns matted with fog. He came through a gap and stood a moment to let his eyes adapt to the different idea of distance that came when the land rose even a little. The air smelled like bark and wet iron instead of mud. His shoulders remembered how to be under trees. He smiled because there are parts of a man that keep their own counsel and forgive him without being asked. The first holdfast he saw was a huddled pile of sod with a door that looked about to fall out of its frame from boredom. A man looked out through a slit and then closed it without speaking. Farther on, across a shallow valley entirely made of wind and dead grass, a square of stone lay thrown down in the weeds like a die a giant had tossed and walked away from. Its roof had gone when the last proper winter took roofs from men who had not hammered their nails in with songs. He climbed the piece of wall that had fallen inward and sat and looked. The road beyond ran in broken bones northeast toward where the barrows began and then farther, to a far river and a city that believed it was a lord among towns because its harbor could take ships and had known how to spit back out invaders once or twice. He was not ready to go there and ask anything of anyone. The small roads are baby brothers to the big ones. The big ones make strangers of you faster. He ate the last of fish from the marsh. The creature shared only what he gave them and did not complain when he had less to give. It was a relief to be among trees where if you failed to catch anything, at least the branches could make you forget hunger for a while by talking. He made a little fire under a fallen trunk when the wind died enough to allow it and warmed the creature's paws by it because they would have pretended for days to be fine and then simply found a patch of heat without telling him that their bones had been muttering. That night, when the fire was a sensible set of coals and not a maw, he heard someone walking the ridge with a foot that knew the ridge and knew he did not. He stilled everything he had, the way you do when a deer puts its head up while grazing. He had learned that in Kinder Woodlands. There was a scrape that was half accidental, half a courtesy to tell him he was observed, and then a figure came where the fire's last light could put a plain edge on them. She was tall, not southern tall, not a string held in a hand and pulled and the girl made thinner for it. She was the tall of a woman raised where food is practical and winter exacts its tax on waste. Her hair was in two thick plaits bound with leather. Her shoulders had learned a bow, not a needle. She had a spear, and the way she fingered it told him she had slept with it under her hand. Her face was not handsome by the work of men who want to own faces. It was Han. Some the way a cliff is, a thing seen from across a field in late afternoon, stern and sufficing. "You make a mean fire," she said. Her voice had the burr that comes from living where the wind has learned your family names. "It's the only kind that will be tolerated in this place," he said. He did not stand or go for his bow. He shifted a little so that his shoulder was not presented impolitely. "If you want it, I have soup left." "I smell fish," she said. She came to the edge of the coals and crouched. She looked at the creatures with the same calm she had at him, and unlike most, she denied herself the flinch or the fascination. She considered and made a decision about them that was not craven and not arrogant. He respected that. "They are not tame," he offered quietly. "Neither am I," she returned. "We will not test who breaks first tonight." She put her hand out, not close enough to the creatures to insult them, close enough to dry it and take the chill off her knuckles. She had scars on those knuckles from other winters. He gave her soup. She ate with concentration and gratitude in balance. When she was done, she set the bowl down as if it were capable of opinion. She glanced once at the quiet egg, the net around it dark with moisture. "Where are you walking?" she asked. "North," he said. "The truth tastes better when it doesn't try to be clever. Away from men I ought to kill before I am ready to forgive myself for doing it." She nodded. "Our family taught that if you name a man in anger, your daughter will have to speak that name when she is born. We tried not to name people when we did not have to." "What do you call the men who hurt you, then?" he asked before he could stop himself. "Hungry," she said, and smiled with only the lower half of her face. "And the ones who were drunk at the wrong time, thirsty. It is easier to lay water and bread in front of words like that. Does it work?" She lifted her hand, turned it over, showed him a palm that had held rope, axe, and nothing he would have put between it and his face. "Sometimes. I came for my sister's boy." He went south with a promise in his pocket. He should have known that promises go rotten near fresh wine. "They will tell me where his bones are. They will give me both boots back if they found them. Then I will decide if I am a woman who likes to throw stones in water or a woman who likes to watch the ripples instead." "I can send a name," he said. The words surprised him. He had not meant to speak any power aloud. She tilted her head. "What name?" "Phrase." He made himself let the air back out after. "Bolton's." She spat, neat, between her boots, with the particular unfriendly precision of the North when it honed its contempt. "Those are names that will eat your bread in your own hall and then wipe their mouths on your wife's apron." She leaned back on her heels. "I am Hild," she added, as if that were a length of wood she had tossed onto a useful pile. "Of the Barrow. We live among the stones and tell our children not to roll off them in play." "You, a man walking," he said. She let him have that without trying to grub under it. She looked at the creatures again and this time allowed herself the small, almost concealed wonder a woman permits herself a moment after she has laughed at a man's joke she liked too much. "Those were dead," she said, not a question. "They were sleeping," he said. "Things that sleep can be waked poorly," she said, a statement and an observation. You do not look like you are worse for it. The worse for it look is different. What look does that have? He had an idea. The one you see on men coming out of a snowstorm with a glove they have not noticed they lost. She put her hand nearer the fire, glanced at him once, not in asking permission. She did not ask, but in courtesy. He nodded as if he had been born with the right to grant it, and then laughed at himself for the reflex. She saw the laugh and let him have that, too. You might not be worse for it, she said. You might simply be changed. That's the one thing people are worse at carrying than grief. They sat, the two of them, not close and not far, with their breath smoking and laying little moments on the night. She told him, in pieces, without ambition to tell a grand story, about the boy. How he had been a poor liar and a fine maker of fish traps, and good with a pig in that way angry animals sometimes give only to one hand in a generation. How he had a mind that hated patterns unless he could claim them as his own. And how he had gone south in a good cloak with a good knife and a letter that had been written by a man who was better at writing than at living. He went to men who do not know the count of the bones under their fields, she said, and the contempt was like ice, without heat, a surface you could lock your teeth on. He went because his sister's dowry was 3 short and the bride's mother had cut her eye at us the last visit. He went because he is young and hates to sit still and listen to old men cough. How long? Robb asked gently. 3 months past the last letter, she said. My mother said let him be, and he will make his way back with his hair shaved for a joke and a tale that will waste our time. My father has been dead in the ground 6 years and still told me to go. The dead do not argue. That's why they last. Where will you look first? He asked. The place where promises are kept as ornaments and not as food, she said dryly. I had thought to go along the White Knife to the Fat City and ask the men there to show me their list of bones. They keep such lists. They like that sort of book. I will pay with news of how the Barrow streams are this year and how many turnips we pulled from a patch that has never been generous. They will teach me how to write one of their letters in return so I can put what I learn in the right sort of black. He nodded. He wanted to tell her to keep away from LLS and from men who called you good wife and looked just above your head when they spoke to you. He wanted to tell her that he had once been a name passed around in hands that had never met him. He did not tell her anything that would make her path his. He was learning how to leave people to their tasks without trying to sew his plans into the lining of their coats. In the small hours, Hild lay with her back to the dead fire, her spear between her knees as if she could become enough wood, if needed, to mend it. She slept like a tree, present and not, a great deal of listening going on quietly. Robb slept with the creature's heat soaking through the folds of his cloak at the ankles and his hand on the net with the third, knowing full well that his hand would not stop a man who wanted that thing, knowing also that sometimes our bodies need to be told by our hands that we are doing right. The next day they walked together a while. She turned off, finally, toward the east, where the road widened and then narrowed again and then considered widening, the way indecisive roads do when they are in low places. She looked at him once before stepping away. You'll be the kind of man those men pretend to greet with their hats, she said. Keep your hat, or wear none. It disturbs them either way. You'll find him, Robb said. He had no right to promise. He offered it as a wish, a stout one. I will find where he went, she said, which was not the same thing. Then she was over the rim and gone, the spear's shaft a thin line that the grass let pass because it had learned to bend for it. He went north until the ground under his feet changed the bones of his stride. He could smell winter not as threat but as an appointment. The barrows rose to the left and right. Low, steady mounds whose grass grew in a different tone, a hair darker, as if it had learned a word the field had not. It is possible to be watched by the dead without fear. It is a complicated comfort, like a map that draws itself as you walk. He took his boots along the path that ran between the oldest mounds and put his hand briefly to one as he passed. Men had been kings here before men learned to put a crown on a sword and a sword through a crown. He did not ask them to rise out of their long work and answer a young man who had more living to do. Sky Song lifted to the first proper wind he had felt since they left the marsh and made a sound like a bar of glass being stroked with a wet finger. Rank flung themselves into the same air and tumbled, delighted in their own misjudgment, slammed into a breath and made of it a trick, and came up under Sky Song by cunning accident. They did not climb much. They rode the first curve of air like boys ride a hill on a plank and eat half of the grass they knock loose for triumph. Robb felt his ribs ache with the wanting to go where they went. He did not turn that wanting into a whip. He watched and honored the small session the air underwrote. In the late afternoon, he stopped at a stand of birch that had lost all of its leaves in one day and had been caught by an early frost and held that way like a hand open to show you it had nothing in it. He hung a pot to steam a handful of barley and the last of a turnip that had pretended very hard to be fresh when he cut into it. He cut the turnip with the small knife he had sharpened on a river stone the way his father had taught him, drawing the blade away from his thumb, and laughed quietly for having that memory arrive with no sting. It was a kind laugh, surprised by itself. That night he dreamed at last of Winterfell, not its hall, the well court where the bucket's rope had always been a little too stiff in winter, and boys had skinned the insides of their palms on it rather than admit that they did not have the strength to pull. He stood there in the dream with water smudged on the stones and light standing in them like coins dropped by accident, and he heard, somewhere, the clash of practice blades that never stopped entirely in any season. He smelled the kennels and the smoke and the fat. He turned his head to see if the heart tree were looking at him from a distance, but the dream would not allow the gods would. It let him have the well. It let him draw up a bucket and look and see his face holding not a crown and not a boy and not a son, but all those words in his skin like letters in shallow carving that you can find with the pads of your fingers and not read aloud without being a little changed by doing it. He woke with a sound he did not make, being still in his mouth and snow on his cloak. The first true snow of that year had chosen him for a place to begin. It lay thin on the net that held the third. It lay even thinner on Rank's back, and Rank sneezed and expressed their disgust with weather by spitting a thread of heat into it, which made a hole that steamed slightly and then filled again. Sky Song tasted a fat snowflake on their tongue as if it were news. He went forward into it with pleasure and with that other, rough feeling inside him that is not fear and not anxiety and has no good name, the one that comes when you know something is about to begin in more than one sense. He found an old shepherd's bothy under a low brow of rock before dawn came and made a shelter of the dragged timbers and the cloak. He slept a little again and woke to the sound of bells. They were goat bells, thin and poor and honest. The goats themselves came bouncing past with their tiny feet like unnecessary punctuation, and behind them a girl with a stick and the posture of someone who had been sent, grudgingly, to drive them to ground in the storm. Her cheeks burned with the cold. Her eyes were the eyes of someone who had eaten nothing much since midday. She saw him and the creatures and put a hand to the purse that was not there at her belt because she owned nothing in it. The goats made basketball sounds in the snow. "They'll be all through your gear," she sighed. By way of introduction, her tone both advisory and unapologetic. "I'll tie what needs tying," he said. "There's no salt here for them, unless you're hiding it." "If I had salt, I'd not be hiding it," she said, grudging, and then after a beat, "I would be hiding it so well I'd not remember where it was. Then I would cry and my uncle would say he never gave it to me. He will say that anyway." "What are those?" "Small," he said, "because that is what they were, in the shape of trouble." She considered the answer, knocked it with the stick, and then accepted it with the pragmatism of someone whose life had already taught her that men can set fire to a barn with a word and call it advice. "I can show you the slope that does not break ankles," she said. "If you go the way everyone goes, you will go where everyone fell last winter and put your foot into the same weak part." "Show me," he said, and because it was a day when the North decided to be tender, she did not shy of the request, but turned on one heel and indicated with the stick the long line of less white where the grass stuck up with more spine. The goats followed in their ecstatic idiocy. "What's your name?" "Gara," she said. "It means nothing. It just is." "Yours?" "Guest," he said without thinking, and then smiled at the way truth sometimes makes a fool of you deliberately. "Reed's Guest," he added, because the name had held him long enough to deserve to be held back. She made a face. "I don't care for reeds. They're always either singing when they ought to hold still or scratching when they ought to be quiet. But if that's what you are, I'll make do." She guided him down an invisible path the storm had not yet learned. They came into a shallow valley where smoke lay flat and mean over a low roof made of thatch and wishes. Men stood there with their arms wrapped around themselves as if they were their last fires. A woman stood at the door with a child on her hip who had the same mouth as the goats and the sense to keep it shut. They watched him arrive with that grudging hope poor people keep so they can keep being poor without breaking. He kept his head level. He did not walk as a lord. He walked as a man with soup in a pot and the wish to share it. "Seat," the woman said, a gruff, necessary charity, like a crust put into your hand without apology. "Water?" he asked. "Spring under the ash," the man on the left said. "Ice on top." His eyes flicked to the creatures, then away in the same instant, a look that said he had learned long ago that he was not important enough to be allowed to possess amazement. Robb took the pot and the cloak and went where the man had indicated. He broke the ice with a knuckle and a grin because the feeling of easy cold was a joy after the marsh's deep damp. He let himself have that small, ridiculous laugh. He took water up, carried it carefully back to the hut, and watched Rank try to catch snowflakes with their mouth open, as if daring the sky to climb inside. He stayed a day because they were the kind of people who say no loudly when they mean yes quietly. He fixed a hinge that had rusted both inside and out. He taught the child with the goat's mouth to set a pot at a tilt above a meager fire to make the heat decide to draw better. He listened to the old man's story of a winter when the wind smoothed everything to a single same and the house had to be shaken awake in the mornings. He learned how many turnips had had worms this year and what that meant for the kind of winter it would be. He listened to Gara insult the goats with love. He bound the third tighter in the net when the girl looked at it too long with a bright and dangerous curiosity. He made soup and did not mention that he had eaten less of it than they had. When he left, the woman put 2 apples in his hand that had wintered in straw and kept their virtue and made an expression on her face that would have been a blessing if she had believed in that sort of thing. "Men came through," the old man said as Robb shouldered the pack and set the net easier on the balance. "With red cloth at their throats and a horse a color the snow liked. They asked questions and then laughed at the answers and then stopped laughing as if it had hurt. They took a chicken and said they had dropped a duck here once and so this was only owed." "Did they say where they were going?" Robb asked. "To a hall that isn't theirs," the old man said. "But then that is all halls now." "Did they smell of river?" "They smelled of a woman's hair that has been brushed with too much oil," the old man said after a moment. "And one smelled of onions and one of the kind of bread that is all seed and no bread and one of the back of a horse where a man has been unkind. Is that enough smell for you?" "It is," Robb said. "Thank you." He went on with the snow deepening and that special light that comes when a storm decides not to make a drama of itself and goes about its business anyway. The world is less color, more white and a kind of blue you only see then and remember wrong later. The heat of the creatures at his boots made an odd twin in that light. He felt lighter for the days being spent on people who would not know or care later what names men put on him. It was a better food than pride. In the white, sound does tricks. He heard a horn that was not, and then a horn that was 2 notes, then a third. Not an alarm, a call to a gate. He turned his head toward a lift in the land where a short wall and a squat tower made an apology for a strong place. Smoke went up stolidly from its roof, a good sign. He approached from the windside, so the guard on the parapet had to lean to see him. "Traveler," the guard called. His nose and cheeks were red with cold, and his voice had the briskness of a man whose job is to keep speaking so his jaw will not lock. "Guest," Robb answered. He felt the old words settle into the air between them as if he had put out both hands. "Bread is why. Ours to offer or to refuse. We have barley and pride," the guard said. "We are low on everything else. Who are your friends?" "Hungry and cold," Robb said, and the guard laughed, a short bark that kept frost from going down his collar. He gestured with his head to the gate. The gate had received so many arguments from men and storms that it had learned patience and turned heavy in self-defense. It opened like an old man rising from his chair. Inside, women stood with their hands on their hips and their heads tied up in one twist against the snow. Children watched as if they were being allowed to spectate on an argument they had heard rumor of and now could finally watch happen. He entered and let his eyes run over everything quickly. The well in the corner with a fur of snow at its edge, the stack of wood that had been well thought out in summer and would still be insufficient by deep winter if no luck came, the old horse with a rag tossed over its back as if that would convince it not to die, the dogs who had made their peace with Thin. He let the snow do its work on the creatures' backs so that they would seem less bright and more like a story other people could not quite put a finger on. They fed him barley and pride, and he brought news that was not news and did not turn into burden because he spoke it as it was. Men had been cruel and weather would be worse, and there were women putting the dead into the ground with more respect than the living gave the living. He did not tell them his name. He told them he had been hungry and had been given goat broth, and he told them that if they took their woodpile and turned it on its face into the wind, the pile would last 3 days longer because of the way winter ate edges, not faces. He mended a child's boot with a stitch that would take it through 1 more week. He took nothing he had not eaten in front of them. He slept by the stove with a dog's head on his ankle and woke to find someone had put a second strip of old blanket over his legs, and he had not needed it and had kept it anyway for the vote of confidence it represented. In the morning, he left behind a little thing that would be news only when it needed to be. In the corner of the stable, under the hawser, he put a small square of leather he had cut with Howland's knife. He had scored it with a reed pattern, the old cut used in the marsh for guest and safe. The head woman would find it when she went to count the plowshares again, because women who run holds count things always. She would turn it over with her thumb and understand it was only a little sign. It would sit in a drawer with other bits under baking paper until such time as men came to ask whose bread she had broken. Then, perhaps, she would take it out and throw it into the fire and nobody would think to look in the ash. Or she would keep it and not know why, and it would matter for someone else years from now who would not know he had passed. In this way, he made a road for himself without asking permission of roads. At the place where the barrows ended in a low shrug and the land became fields that had been abused and were trying to forgive, he saw a band of riders. They did not ride in a lord's array, but they had discipline and an idea of themselves. Their cloaks were pale with frost and they had the color at the throat the old man had described, a mean red dyed with weed. Their leader had a beard that had been carefully neglected. His face was raw where the wind had taken it. They saw him and put their bodies into a shape that was neither escort nor threat. Their horses snorted steam. "You're out early," the leader said. He had the rough voice of a man who has used it to be heard over other men in bad places. "So are you," Robb said. "I chose it. It looks like you were sent." He smiled without teeth. The leader did not rise to the nettle. "We escort grain," he said. "Bandits ride these fields. They do not have the decency to starve where they were put to it. They come up and take men's carts in the lane and call it duty to their families." "Are you bringing your grain to this hold?" Robb asked, letting his head tilt a little toward the place he had just left. The leader's eyes flicked that way and then back. "We bring grain to men who will pay," he said evenly. "Do you carry trade?" "Stories," Robb said. "Some people will pay for those." "Not with grain," the leader said and half-turned his horse. "Avoid the ditch. It is deep under the snow and full of lies. We lost a man there last week and found him again yesterday when the wind thought better of its plan." Robb nodded. "Good luck with your carts," he said. "May they be empty of bandits and full of what you put in them." The leader grunted, a consent to let him pass without having to hear or say more, and clicked his tongue. The riders moved, not as a column, not as a mob, as a long animal that knows how to keep all its feet under it in a drift. They were no friend to him, and they were not his enemies from the hall either. It is possible to travel in a country where there are men like that and not be destroyed. It is even possible to be saved by them against their will. He filed them in his head the way you file whether seen, noted, not believed in. That night he chose to camp under a line of firs whose lower branches were thick and old and stooped in grudging service. The creatures made a little clearing of heat with their breath and their irritation. Rank would never make peace with snow. Skysong found it acceptable because Skysong found everything acceptable and only later decided whether it deserved to be. He ate the apple the woman had given him, the flesh sour and perfect and the skin tough and sweet like a story has to be if it's going to last. He gave the other apple to the girl in his memory, Gera, and smiled to himself at the stupidity of that and ate it too. In the small hours, the third moved in its sleep for the first time. He woke to the sound like a bird bumping a window in summer, a soft, definite tap. He got his hand under the net and found it warm, not in the surface way it had been warming as a stone warms, but warm like a thing making its own argument to the cold. He did not fumble for the knife. He did not go looking for the right prayer. He put his palm flat and let the thing inside whatever lay around it feel the weight of a man's hand. He made his breath slow. He did not demand. He did not beg. He made himself large as the old tree had taught him to be, but not taller than his shape deserved. When the movement stopped, he smiled in the dark and rolled onto his back and stared up through the fir's black-limbed geometry until the stars repositioned themselves a little, as if they too had heard something stir. In the morning he came upon the first of the Barrow folk proper, a family dressed in that particular patchwork of leather and wool that says a place is both poor and proud. They had sleds. One sled held a low bronze pan that had worked its way through 3 lifetimes and refused to be retired because the hands that used it admired its obstinacy. The woman at the head of the train had a look that said she had made a bargain with winter and would not default. When she saw him, she did not start or smile. She inclined her head a degree, a queen's degree, the approval granted a man who keeps himself upright in a wind. He returned it. They went their way and he went his, and a raven watched all of them out of a birch like a gossip thinking of a way to make the scene do better for its listeners later. He avoided the river road because rivers keep secrets by broadcasting them. He went at a diagonal where fields had been and would be again, people willing. He saw a watchtower that had lost its top third and someone had put a roof on it to make it useful again. A patch too neat for the original design and no shame in that. He saw a boy practicing with a stick and a skillet for a shield while his sister shouted insults with loving form to keep him honest. He saw a man in the snow on his knees, not praying, holding the stump of an apple tree that had died the last hard winter and saying something that might have been an apology. He saw the head of a wolf at sunset, once, just above the rise of a hill, and a body only when it chose to show him, long and lean and gray. The creature stood considering him with that ancient attention that is not useful to a man because it reminds him that the world has purposes that will never include him. He lifted his hand. It did not bow because wolves are honest. It stood, then turned its head to look off to his left, then back to him, then left again, a slow, deliberate movement. He went the way the head had pointed after the wolf had walked away with the confidence of a being that never steps where it cannot step out of. He found there, less than 2 miles on, a little circle within a copse, where someone had laid stones in the old way and hung from a low, stubborn oak a string of bones bound with reed. It was not southern work. There was a mark on the biggest stone like the one he had left at the stable, only larger and more honest. He went to one knee and put his hand there as he had put it to the egg. He did not ask. He said in the quiet place in him that had always known how to speak to trees, "I am still walking. Let this be counted in my favor." It is possible to go silently over miles when something waits that will be bigger than sleep and food. He knew now, in that small bone behind the ear where old men tap boys when they cry for nothing, that the egg would not wait to choose. He had thought to keep walking to Winterfell and put this new birth under the gaze of the old tree. That was a boy's thought, that he could choreograph respect and make it tidy. The thing inside the third had its own calendar. He made a camp in a hollow with a ring of notched stones and the remains of a recent fire and the faint smell of someone who had been there before him and had left because they had remembered something they could do nothing about at this hour. He laid the net out and loosened it a little, then tightened it again because he could not help himself. Rank climbed into his cloak without asking permission and made a small angry sound at the cold while tolerating it. Skysong lay along the edge of the hollow with their head near Robb's hand and their tail toward where the wind came in. He set his palm on the egg. There was no drama. There was heat. There was a weight not measured in stones. There was a pulse that might have been his own and might not have. He put his other hand flat on the ground to stabilize the world and waited. When the crack came, it was the right size. Not show, not fright. A line in the surface like the first scratch made by an animal being born into a world that had a long time for it. He did not reach for the knife. He reached for names and set them aside. He reached for old words and found them like the bones under snow. He breathed in when the egg took heat and breathed out when it let it go. When the first sliver fell away, Rank made a sound, something like satisfaction and something like envy that they had not been first to do everything. And Skysong opened their eyes and blew a small breath toward the gap, not fire, air warmed as if to tell an infant that someone else had been trying before them. It was dark before the hole was large enough to be called a hole. The thing inside worked as if work had been invented for it. Patience is not something newborns own. This one had the single-mindedness of a river forced to find a new bed. When the head came, it was different from Skysong's blunt, from Rank's oil-sheen quickness. It had a bone line to it that would one day make men think of a spear, not a club. Its eye opened and was the color of rain that has decided to freeze and keeps changing its mind. It coughed, and he laughed, because that was Ho. This always would begin with these things, ridiculous and divine. The mouth opened and heat came, hesitant. A child who does not know if the room is friendly. The steam curled, then broke like a small wave. "Hello," he said, because it mattered, and he put no more than that into the word, because people have a way of thinking prayers are for gods alone. The thing came out of itself. It found his hand, not because it loved him and not because he commanded it, but because his hand was where heat and steadiness and the rhythm of breath were. It put its face into his palm like a tired soldier. Its hide had a nap that went against his skin when it breathed in and went with it when it breathed out. It made a sound he had not heard from the others. A tightening little chirr that made the hair rise on his forearms and settle again. Both. He felt the old tree's eyes on the crown of his head as if someone had set a cool hand there, and for a heartbeat he was not in the hollow on damp leaves but in the godswood stillness. Then he was back and the creature in his hand was a new truth. He found a name and did not lace it to any memory. He made it from the way the thing had carved itself out from its own cage. "Shard," he said softly. "And if we are bloody and late for supper, and you will not come when I call you in the rain, Shard it will be." The creature stilled. The pupils pinched, focused, let go, widened. Names matter. The new one accepted this one as a thing it would have to discuss later and did not argue now. He slept with 3 small hearths near him, and when morning came, he was not warm, but he was less cold. He fed them all 3 with careful, unproud hands. He watched for greed that would be dangerous to their health and corrected it. He gave more to the smallest because it needed it more, and kept the distribution unfair and true and would not later call the statecraft because he would not insult what he had learned from lizards by putting a crown on the lesson. He went on. Winterfell was a word made of stone and snow and smoke and rule. He would not go to it like a beggar trying to get warm by its fire before he had remembered how to put his hands out for himself. He went among smaller places and asked for smaller things. He stayed out of the line of march of men who wanted to make their names sound good in other men's halls. He was quicker now and slower, quicker with the bow and the judgment, slower with the anger and the pride. He taught a woman at a mill how to ease the rope's bite by wetting it and then rubbing ash with a drop of oil into the place it would wear. He taught a boy that a spear with a head that drank light, simple black glass, could make a better argument to men who thought they were immortal than a rusty sword ever had. He left in that boy's hut a little twist of reed tucked under the straw where he slept. The boy would find it on a day when someone stood in the door with red cloth at his throat and asked whether the boy had seen a man walking with 2 dangerous ideas in his shadow. He would not know why the reed's twist in his palm made his heart steady. He would answer simply, and it would be enough. In all this, he did not take his eyes off the shape of the world where it was not yet his to love. Winterfell rose inside him and outside him like a weather change. He would not go there until he had the courage to walk beneath the walls and not demand that they give him back everything they had taken. A part of him still wanted to. The part that had learned humility and skill and lesser food held it down until it stopped twitching and became a small animal he could feed with discipline and not toss raw meat to. He spoke to the old tree at night without words. He spoke to his father sometimes, a shorter conversation without the familiar ache. He spoke to his mother without flinching and without begging her to speak back. He spoke to Nella only once, because that name was a knife and knives do their work best if you do not handle them constantly. Nella, meanwhile, had not learned to sleep. In the twins, the great fire burned as if it could ignore the smell of old blood in its stones. Men drank with relief that made their jokes tired faster. Nella made dough with arms that had become ropes. She turned on a man's palm with a ladle when his hand came where it was not invited and put the back of the ladle to his knuckles with a fierceness that surprised him into humor rather than anger, because humor would carry him to his bed faster, and he was trying to give himself the appearance of being generous with his forgiveness. She kept her head turned down enough that nobles would not remember her, and up enough that men would not think she was trying to learn their secrets and therefore must be useless or dangerous. She listened. Secrets are not whispered in corners only. They are shouted in kitchens where knives go through onions and onions make men cry and pretend it is the onion. She learned which one of the boys on watch dozed and which shaped his boredom into cruelty. She learned that the boltmaker in the outworks had a wife in a sod hut who was smarter than the other wives and would, if asked, hide a man in the root cellar for an extra pinch of salt and a promise of stories. She learned that the old man who tended the bells could make them sing in a pattern that was not the warning for fire and not the warning for men at the water, and therefore a pattern that, if taught, could be used to say the word for safe. At night she put her head down on the straw that had been given her in place of a bed and slept for a moment and woke, because memory sometimes insists on being owed more than people can pay in daylight. She sat up and put her hands around her knees and thought of the rivers cold like a promise kept. She thought of a boy putting his hand into cold water to pull a rope and not letting go because the hand belonged to a body that had not decided its fate. She thought of his face in that first moment when he could not believe that the world could go on and had decided to outstare it until it agreed that it could not. She thought of nothing else. She did not cry. She was a girl with no mother and the sort of stubbornness that grows in people who were denied the assurance of a piece of bread when they were small. She practiced how to braid secrets into the plaits of her hair, so the guards would not find them when they laughed and demanded to see. She sent a child with a cob of half-dried corn to the boltmaker's wife and counted backwards slowly the number of days it would make sense for a man to reach the Black Shore if he had been carried halfway by a river that had chosen, for once, to do the decent thing. She watched for a sign that made sense only to her and one other person in the marsh. She carved a little mark into the underside of one of the benches in the buttery with a spoon's edge, the reed sign. When she had finished it, she felt a small piece of her body stop trembling. A maid came and asked what she was doing. She said she had been counting the rings in the wood to see how old the bench was. The maid laughed and called her daft and put a piece of bacon in her hand under the guise of cuffing her. She ate the bacon in 3 bites and wiped the grease on her apron and went on with her day, which was made of knives and shouting and the careful avoidance of certain eyes. Howland sat with his feet in cold water and his hands on his knees. He listened to the river teach its fish to ignore his toes. He had sent the boy out with nothing but his own first name masked, and he had not yet regretted it. Regret is a luxury of men who have not chosen well. He had chosen well, and that does not mean his heart had a simpler time of it. The marsh told him things not because it loved him and not because he was clever, though he was. It told him things because he had reinforced a bridge and it decided to let him cross. He knew that the third had cracked not by any messenger or raven or dream. He would dignify with a name, but because a root had moved under his heel that afternoon without a wind. That is a kind of news, and men who think it is foolish are welcome to freeze on their own paths. He visited the cave again on a day when the Black Shore tolerated him. There was a youth with him, not his own. His were off where their work had sent them, learning to see and to make themselves seen only in the moments they meant to. This youth had hair like horse brush and eyes that looked best at water. Howland stood at the bowl and put his hand on the rim and did not lean. The eggs were gone, and the bowl looked like a mouth someone had breathed into and then not used for too long. The youth made a sound of disappointment and then swallowed it because he had been told to learn how to swallow sounds and had taken the advice unwillingly and for love. "Not our children," Howland said. "We do not count them among any we ought to weep over." "Where will he take them?" the youth asked, the breath clouding in front of him and falling. "Where a man takes the part of himself he is afraid will be stolen," Howland said. where he is tempted to hide what must be used instead, where he will be able to speak to them without men asking him to make them tricks for fairs. He will still be asked to do that. He will need to learn to refuse kindly but hard. Will he remember us? The youth asked, and this was not a boy's question at all. It was old. Yes, Howland said, unless we are unlucky enough to become easy to carry. The youth frowned and then smiled, the smile of someone who has decided he will understand it when it is his turn to say the sentence to a child he is responsible for. Howland put his hand to the cave wall and then to his chest, like a man closing a book that does not exist and tucking it into his shirt. Robb walked. He did not go straight. He made himself learn the bend of the land in winter when snow makes you wish for the lakes of summer and then kills you where the ice lies to the weight of a man. He learned the sounds men make when they are starving, and he learned the way pride will make a person turn you away from the door and hope you will take the hint that they are doing it to save their child their portion and not because they mistrust you. He learned to leave food where no one would have to say thank you out loud. He learned the crack of old wood under his boot and made himself step around it rather than through because this year there would be less wood every day and he had no right to be careless with anything that could heat someone's bone. He came in the last days before the year turned and the low sun made a habit of hovering near the earth and never getting up properly, to a rise of ground and a stand of trees that were not fir and not birch. He knew them before he saw them as a body knows the smell of home even when home has been changed while it was away. The God's Wood at Winterfell had its own weather. It made wind for itself. It made a quiet that was not silence but the never-ending sum of small living noises arranged so carefully that men call it silence out of respect. He stood at the low wall and put both hands to the stone and let the cold of it go into his palms. He did not climb. He did not jump. He stepped over, like a son who has come to the back door so as not to disturb anyone. The heart tree was as it had been, eyes, mouth, tears. It had seen a boy run with sticks in his hand across the sod. It had seen a man kneel when he did not understand that he was a man yet. It had seen another man die in front of it because men think that where gods live long, they will be kind, and the gods had watched and considered and counted. It saw him now with two small pieces of the old world crawling and gliding and hanging on him like ornaments someone wiser than he had hung and which had turned out to be heavy and good. Saw the third, newly born, in his hands. It had opinions. It did not smile. Trees do not. He did not kneel. He wanted to and did not. He went to the place his father had gone and his father before him had gone and stopped and set the net down and set his palm to the rough, old, cold face. He felt the first thaw under the bark. No thaw yet, the promise of it, the way a dog in the corner of a room will lift its head a fraction when someone it loves comes to the door and then put it down again out of sheer discipline. The tree knew him. He did not insist it like him. I came because you are old, he said to it without moving his mouth, because doing it in his throat like a stupid boy would have been an offense to the place. I came because I am young and will make a mess without men to tell me not to. Men are poor at that when they love you. They spill their fear on you when they try to save you. You will not do that, I think. You will sting when I get it wrong and forgive me when I get it right by accident. I ask no more. I ask not to be turned away. The wind moved once. Snow let go of a branch and fell where his father had once sat on cold mornings to come to a decision. He put his hand down to the base of the tree and the creatures put their noses to the same place, one by one, with no training he had given them and no heroics and no mind to impress him with their suitability. The heart tree kept its counsel. After a while, he heard a foot in the snow behind him. It was a careful foot, the actually careful, not the show quiet of men who think themselves hunters and are only loud without thinking. He did not turn. The foot came closer and then stopped and then, after a long moment, began again. A man came into his vision at the edge, at the limit where the tree would tolerate men standing side by side with other men. He wore maesters black and gray. His chain was thin and mismatched, links of several metals strung together by need and time and war and loss. His hair had receded like a tide that will not come back in this age. His hands were full of manners. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "I did not mean to intrude." "You didn't," Robb said. He kept his hand on the tree and watched the maester in the corner of his eye. "We have had dreams," the maester said. We have had dreams for a year. Men say they have when they mean they slept badly and woke tired. I say we have had dreams. The ravens were busy and then went slack. The mice came late and then apologized to the cat for their manners. The children played without being called in. The cook burned the turnips and no one was cross, and then they were. The dreams came the nights between those days. He smiled in apology. Forgive me, I don't speak straight as well as I once did. I mean that there have been signs in the ways an old man sees signs in his own body and calls them by whatever names he learned in days when he had more to do. And now, he gestured, one hand without flourish. You are here, and I find that I am not surprised and think that perhaps I should be, and I cannot decide whether that shows I am a fool or old. You might be both, Robb said, and smiled so the man would not take that as a cruelty. I am both, most days. The maester laughed, a brief, relieved bark. You have your father's disrespect for the shape men say sentences should take. He looked at the creatures again and then moved his eyes away the way one moves one's eyes from something that might be a god and might be a thing that belongs to no gods at all. There are men in the hall, he said, whose names I am not sure you will like to hear. There are women who will speak your mother's name in a way that will scald you and mean to comfort. There are children, fewer than there ought to be. There is a boy who looks at the wall and does not see it and is useful to us in odd hours. There are men with brooches they bought from other men who like to pretend they were given them by someone who had the right to give. There is bread. Bread, Robb said. The word had more mean in it than his face let show. He took his hand from the tree and it stung. Not in the way of a slap, more like the way a dog will take your sleeve in its mouth and tug to say stop making a fool of yourself. He inclined his head to the tree and did not pretend it nodded back. He turned then to the maester. I have meat I stole from the air, he said. I will share it for your bread. For now, in this wood, not in your hall. The maester's mouth twitched. He was a man who had learned to put an entire speech into a glance. He looked at the creatures again and then leaned on his stick in the way men do who will not confess their joints, and then nodded. If I cannot bring a lord to a hall for bread, he said, I can damn well bring bread to a lord in a wood, and if that ruins my training, then good for it. I am not a lord, Robb said. You are a thing men will call a lord if that is the best word they have to soothe their own fear, the maester said bluntly. You will accept the bread, whatever word I use, because you are starving and you have been too proud to say so. Robb grinned at that and did not deny it, because it was a pleasure to be known cleanly by someone who had nothing to gain by knowing you. Bring the bread, he said. Bring no one else. If I bring 2 boys to carry it, you will tolerate it, the maester said. If you bring those boys and they are the right boys, I will make them laugh and they will go home and speak of a man who taught a small gray beast to make a steam ring, and there will be happiness in your kitchen that will keep the fire from sulking, Robb said, and the maester, hearing the truth of it, smiled in a way that looked like medicine working. He went. Robb sat again with the tree and let his breath run slow so that the creatures would match it, which they did because that is one argument warm things do not like to have with each other in winter. He as not the boy who had left. He was not the man who had walked into the hall to be made a boiled piece of meat at a table set with promises boiled harder. He was not a god. He had heat and quiet and the beginnings of an army that would not march but would bring people out of their houses at the sound of an overhead shadow and make them lift their faces and feel alive. That was enough to start with. For now, he stayed under the bare arms of the tree and put his hand on the rough pale bark and stroked it as if it had fur. The bread came warm. The boys were wide-eyed and afraid and brave and excellent. He taught them to make steam rings by pinching their cheeks and to throw them by closing their lips at the last instant. And they threw rings and tried to bite them, and the maester pretended not to smile and failed. Sky Song accepted a crust because Sky Song believed in friendship as a principle. Rank stole a crust out of the boy's glove and then repented and put it back because the boy looked more offended than afraid. Shard, newly born, slept through the entire exchange like someone who has known too few winters to respect their hours. When the bread was gone and good, and the last ring had been thrown and the last little shock of laughter had shaken the tree's remote attention, the maester stood with care. You cannot sleep in this wood always, he said. That is bad news. The good news is that you do not have to sleep in those halls either. But you cannot pretend they are not there. They will send for you if you do not send for them. Better to choose. I will, Robb said, but not tonight. He looked toward the stone buildings that had been put there long before anyone now living had learned to say their names properly. I have to learn the manner of this place again. It has learned yours, the maester said, and it was not flattery. He looked at the creatures with a new level gaze. If they fly over the village at noon, the old women will take their shawls and fold them over the backs of their chairs while they stand in the doors and look up without moving. The men will pretend to go about their business and look up more. The children will run about until they fall down in the mud, and mothers will decide that today they will not mind. Do not make them do that too many days in a row. Men exhaust themselves with wonder as quickly as with fear. I will be stingy with miracles, Robb said, and they both smiled at the way men try to be wise. After a time, when the bread had sat a good hour inside him and turned into a gentler heat, Robb stood and lifted the net and set it again on his back. The maester's eyes flicked to the knot used to bind it and then back up again. That knot, he said. I have not seen it since I was a boy, and a woman a head shorter than me took my hand and led me across a place where my father said men drowned because the ground ate them for not listening. Do not say who taught it, Robb said quietly. Do not guess. The marsh is a place that forgets for you when you ask, and I owe it more forgetting than you will need to do on my account. I know how to keep my tongue, the maester said, piqued, and then let the injured pride slide off him because he had practice. It is a good knot. It will come undone when it is asked politely, and not before. That is the shape of most things I love, Robb said, and looked once more at the heart tree and the faces it made. He lifted 2 fingers to his brow and then to his chest, and then held them out slightly to the creatures and then to the maester, a clumsy, earnest, entirely invented salute. The old man imitated it with a grave foolishness befitting the moment. Tomorrow? The maester asked. Tomorrow, Robb said. Do you want me to bring any names? Bring none, Robb said. We will find them together when we have done a little work and are not hungry. In the other part of the world of this same house, men with red at their throats gathered and made lists and attempted to tell each other jokes that would make the air warmer. Women counted blankets and then counted them again in case arithmetic had changed. Children were told to put wax to the cracks in an old window and did it happily until the wax got on their sweaters, and then they cried here and there because nothing can be perfect. In the hall, men put axes across their knees as if that made them chairs. A man with a face like the bottom of a pail sat at the long table and tried to remember if he had made a bargain he had not yet broken. Outside, the cold did its simple math and decided to be colder. He slept in a little hut of hedge and memory, because a hut offered him more privacy than the hall of his father. He woke in a cold that was the first honest cold he had felt in years because it was his choice to feel it. He rose before the light came up into the window like a shy man and took a stalk of dried mint from a bundle over the little stove and crushed it and put it in the water and inhaled the idea of the tea as if the real thing would insult his decision to do without. He fed the creatures and they tolerated their hunger with the high, unimpeachable patience of beasts who do not know that men are making a script out of their lives. He went and stood with his hands behind his back the way his father had stood and looked over the low wall toward the village and saw that the smoke came straight up this morning because the wind had decided to rest. He laughed under his breath at the idea of wind resting. At noon, because he is a man and men sometimes break rules just because they can now, he walked the creatures along the edge of the commons where the women had laid fish to freeze in the clean cold and the dogs had learned not to mistake that neatness for a courtesy. The children followed at a distance like small birds walking behind a man scattering grain without meaning to. A woman with one hand held a baby and the other held a loaf and made a face at him that he had not seen since before. It was the face of someone who says without malice, "Are you going to do something stupid and useful for us or something grand and useless for yourself?" "Stupid and useful," he said, turning to her with a grin. "But later. Today I am going to do nothing at all and call it strategy." She snorted. "You have your mother," she said. It was the best blessing he had received since she died. He bowed his head into it like a man under a roof that did not leak and then straightened and went on. By the third day, men had knocked down the sod wall between two huts and made a bigger room. Children gathered on the edge of it to stick their tongues out to the hard air and laugh at the way your own breath comes back to burn you when it is that cold. He taught 3 boys to tie the reed knot and told them it was a trick for fishing lines because they liked the word trick and because it made them forget they were learning something that would one day keep them from crying when men came to ask questions. He sent a woman unhappy with her roof to the maester with a list of things the small dragons could not help with. He sent a man who had come late to the village to tell him truthfully that if he meant to steal, now was the best time because men were tired. The man laughed and did not steal and later built a fence for the neighbor and called it theft to keep his own counsel. He stayed 10 days. If he had stayed 11, men would have begun to bring him their every small decision, and he would have broken them by kindness and the need to be useful. He left when the children had learned to be used to the newcomers overhead enough to ignore them half the time and call it being brave. He left a sign under a plank in the stairs at the tower. He left bread in the well house for a woman who would not admit she was hungry. He left 3 pieces of black glass in a pouch under the maester's desk and a note with the crude, honest drawing of a reed on it so the old man would not think the knives had come from a ghost. He left the godswood without touching the tree except with his eyes because there is a time to touch and a time to not, and he had learned both and would be learning them until he died. When he went east and then north to the water that leads to the fat city. Not because he cared for that city just then, but because men he needed had drifted toward it as minnows drift toward bigger, lazier fish. He went with the creatures making 3 shadows when the sun bothered to show. He went with a face that had learned to be recognized and then to become again the face of a man you would not notice unless your life needed him. He went with bread in his pack and old words in his mouth and new words in his hands. The air had that taste of iron and answer that tells a man he has a day or two before other men decide to add their own answers to it. There would be halls again and tables and the ruin of vows and the restoration of some other vow by a better man on a worse day. There would be the long march of a winter that had no interest in his story. There would be people, which is to say, work. There would be names to give back to men who had spent their own on easier things and wanted them returned now like coins to a gambler. There would be dragons, not the story you tell at night to make yourself large in the eyes of a child, not the traveling carnival trick the South would try to trade songs for, but the honest heat of 3 creatures with very little use for the idea of kings and a very good use for the idea of intention. And there would be a road bigger than all that and smaller and underneath. The one he had set his feet on when he had been pulled by a girl with river hands out of a house designed for men to die in and made of men dying. He would walk it until his feet remembered what they had known as boys. He would not be alone, not in the way that kills a man. He would be alone in the way that trains him to accept being found. At a bend in a low lane where the hedges were less prickly because boys had cut them each winter for arrows and not apologized. He turned his head because a note in the air had changed. It was not the sound of men. It was not the sound of weather. It was the sound of a body recognizing another body that had once held it up. He looked back south through the narrow window of the lane and imagined, not how it had been, not how it should be, but how it would be soon when he had learned to be stupid and useful enough to deserve it. Then he set his shoulders, rolled them to find the place where the ache did not argue, and kept going into the fine, bitter light of a northern afternoon that makes your eyes water and your lungs feel as if they have been scrubbed with snow and old bark.